Welcome, welcome. You're here at Arcane Paradox. Today we present to you, what if Madame Pomfrey's mandatory health scan at sorting revealed 52 active loyalty potions in Harry and Dumbledore's 60-year conspiracy shattered live. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1. The candles in the Great Hall had been burning for exactly 47 minutes when Madame Pomfrey walked in and changed everything. Nobody noticed her at first. Why would they? The sorting was already halfway through the alphabet, and the enchanted ceiling was doing that thing it did on clear September nights, pouring starlight down onto 400 upturned faces like something out of a painting. The first years were clustered at the front of the hall in their two big robes and their two wide eyes, and the older students were doing what older students always did, eating, talking, placing quiet bets on which house the nervous-looking kids would end up in. Madame Pomfrey walked the length of the staff table with the kind of posture that said she had somewhere more important to be, which was always. She leaned down and said something in Dumbledore's ear. He smiled at her, that warm, grandfatherly smile that made people feel like everything was being handled, and gave a small nod. She turned to face the hall. "Your attention, please." Her voice carried without effort. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years telling students to stop moving their broken arms. It commanded compliance on a biological level. The hall went quiet. Beginning this term, all incoming first-year students will undergo a standard magical health diagnostic before the sorting hat is placed. This is a ministry-recommended precaution. It is non-invasive, it takes less than 30 seconds, and it is entirely routine. She set a shallow stone basin on the stool beside the sorting hat. It looked like a pensieve, except the liquid inside it was the color of pale smoke rather than silver. Beside it, she placed a crystal rod about the length of a wand, smooth, perfectly clear, utterly unremarkable. When your name is called, you will step forward, hold the diagnostic rod for 10 seconds, and then be sorted as normal. The results will be reviewed by the school mediwitch only. A pause. Unless the diagnostic identifies something requiring immediate attention, in which case protocol requires disclosure to the relevant authorities. Are there any questions? There were not. Nobody questioned Madame Pomfrey. Not even Dumbledore, who was still smiling his smile, his half-moon glasses catching the candlelight. The line of first years shuffled. A boy near the back, round-faced, already holding his toad too tight, looked like he might be sick. Professor McGonagall unrolled her parchment. Abbott, Hannah. Hannah Abbott stepped forward, took the diagnostic rod with both hands, held it for 10 seconds while it glowed a steady and unremarkable amber, and then went to sit beneath the sorting hat while the hall waited. The hat considered her for exactly 4 seconds before shouting Hufflepuff, and the yellow trim table erupted, and everything was completely normal. It stayed normal through Bones, Susan and Boot, Terry and Brocklehurst, Mandy. The diagnostic rod glowed amber for all of them. A few showed minor results, iron deficiency in one girl, a mild calming draft residue in one boy that Pomfrey noted without comment, but nothing that changed the rhythm of the evening. The hall relaxed back into its comfortable rhythm of food and gossip. Granger, Hermione. A girl with a great deal of bushy brown hair and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment specifically marched to the front of the hall with her chin up. She took the diagnostic rod like she was accepting an award, held it with perfect stillness for 10 seconds. The rod glowed amber. Hermione looked faintly disappointed by this, as though she'd hoped for something more interesting, and went to sit under the sorting hat. It took the hat nearly 4 minutes to decide on Gryffindor. This was unusual enough that a few of the older students traded glances. The Gryffindor table cheered, slightly uncertainly, and Hermione Granger sat down with the expression of someone who had won an argument she hadn't been sure she'd win. More names. More amber. Longbottom, Neville dropped his toad twice on the way to the diagnostic stool, took the rod with a hand that shook visibly, and held it for 10 seconds. The rod glowed amber, but for just a fraction of a second, in the deep core of the crystal, something pulsed dark purple, there and gone so fast that only Madame Pomfrey seemed to catch it. She made a small note on her parchment with the expression of a woman filing that away for later. Neville then sat under the hat for a very long time before it sent him to Gryffindor, and he looked shocked to be there, and the hall applauded with genuine warmth for reasons nobody could quite explain. Malfoy, Draco. The boy who stepped forward had been waiting for his name the way a chess piece waits to be moved, with the absolute certainty that it will be, and soon. He walked to the diagnostic stool with a small, performative smile already in place. Took the rod. Held it. Amber. He almost looked surprised, as though he'd expected something more dramatic out of himself too. Then the hat barely touched his head before shouting Slytherin, and the silver-green table welcomed him with the specific kind of applause that was also a statement of loyalty. More names. More amber. The evening continued. And then McGonagall said, "Potter, Harry." The reaction was immediate and total. Every head in the hall turned. The whisper moved through the room like a wave, "Potter, Harry Potter, the Harry Potter," and 400 students craned to get a look at the boy who shuffled forward from the back of the first-year line. He was smaller than most people expected. That was the first thing. Thin, with knobbly knees visible below his robes and dark hair that appeared to have never once obeyed a comb. He wore glasses that were slightly too large for his face, and he looked at the floor more than at anything else, and there was something about him, some quality in the set of his shoulders, that made you want to look away, as though looking directly at him might embarrass him. He made it to the stool. He picked up the diagnostic rod. The entire great hall held its breath. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. The rod was clear. Madame Pomfrey stood with her quill ready, watching the crystal with professional patience. Then the rod began to glow. Amber first, the usual color, and then something shifted underneath it. A deep, churning red bled up through the amber like ink dropped in water. Then threads of dark purple, coiling. Then black, actual black, pulsing from the core outward, and then a color that nobody in the hall could name because it sat in the spectrum somewhere between dark gold and something wrong, something that made the back of your eyes ache when you looked at it directly. The smoke in the stone basin beside the stool began to move. It rose in ribbons at first, thin, distinct threads lifting from the liquid surface and hanging in the air at roughly chest height. 1 ribbon. 2. 5. The hall was completely silent now. Even the ghosts had stopped drifting. The candle flames had gone perfectly still, as though the air in the room had forgotten to breathe. Madame Pomfrey took 1 step forward. Then stopped. The ribbons kept coming. 10. 15. They were taking shapes now, not exactly symbols, not exactly words, but something between the two. Magical residue given form. Each ribbon represented an active compound in the boys' system, and every single person at the staff table who had any training in diagnostic magic understood what they were seeing, and none of them moved because they were all, in their various ways, unable to process the fact that it was real. 20 ribbons. 25. Dumbledore's smile did not change. That was the thing that Minerva McGonagall would remember for the rest of her life, that his smile did not change. 30. Pomfrey. Professor Flitwick's voice came out barely above a whisper from the staff table. "Poppy, how many? I'm counting." Her voice was tight and completely level in the way that voices go when the person using them is operating on sheer professional reflex. "Please be quiet." 40. Harry Potter was still holding the rod with both hands. He was staring at the smoke ribbons with an expression that nobody could read, not frightened, not confused, just watching, the way you watch something you are slowly beginning to understand. One of his hands had started to shake. He pressed both down harder on the rod, steadying himself. 45. The ribbon nearest to him, the thickest, darkest one, pulsing with that wrong gold color, drifted toward his chest and then flinched away, as though the rod was actively pulling the compounds into the light and they were resisting. 46. 47. At 49 ribbons, Professor Sprout made a sound. It was a small, involuntary sound, the kind you make when you see something fall. 50. 51. The rod in Harry's hands cracked down the center. Not broke, cracked, a perfect lightning bolt fracture running from base to tip that lit up from within with white light. Harry didn't drop it. He held on. 52. The last ribbon rose from the basin and hung in the air, and then all 52 of them began to rotate slowly around Harry Potter like planets finding orbit, each one a different shade of wrong, and the diagnostic basin went dark, and the crystal rod went cold in his hands, and the great hall was so quiet you could hear the lake outside. Madame Pomfrey turned to face the hall. Her face was the color of old parchment. Her quill was still in her hand. She looked, for just a moment, like a woman trying to decide whether to speak or to simply walk out of the castle and keep walking. She spoke. 52 active magical compounds, she said. Her voice carried the same way it had at the beginning of the evening, except now there was something underneath it, something that made the younger students press together instinctively. Of which 47 are classified loyalty and compliance potions in various stages of long-term administration. 3 are memory modification compounds. 1 is an emotional suppression draft of a complexity I have not personally encountered in 30 years of practice. And 1 inch, she paused, and in that pause you could hear the candles, is a blood loyalty curse. Active. Rooted. Another pause. These compounds have been administered over a period of not less than 10 years. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the great hall erupted. It wasn't the clean explosion of cheering that happened when Gryffindor won the Quidditch Cup. It was the messy, ragged sound of 400 people reacting in 400 different ways simultaneously, shouts, gasps, chairs scraping, someone at the Ravenclaw table actually standing up, a cluster of Hufflepuff third years grabbing each other's arms. The ghosts began speaking all at once. 3 candles guttered out. In the middle of it all, Harry Potter stood by the sorting stool and looked at the 52 ribbons of magical residue floating around him, and something in his face was changing. It was the slowest thing in a very fast room, so subtle that only the people watching him directly, rather than each other, would have caught it. But it was there. Something behind his eyes was coming awake. Quiet. McGonagall's voice cut through the noise like a blade and the hall went sharp still. She was on her feet, both hands on the staff table, and her expression was one that even 7th-year Gryffindors had never seen before, not the controlled anger of someone enforcing rules, but the raw, unprocessed look of someone whose understanding of an entire decade had just been surgically removed. She turned to her left. Albus. 1 word. Flat. Specific. Dumbledore set down his wine glass. He folded his hands. He turned to look at Minerva with that same expression, patient, warm, luminous with the particular kind of light that had made generations of students feel safe, and said, "Minerva. There is a great deal of context, the diagnostic basin record source signatures." Madame Pomfrey's voice came again, hard and clean as a scalpel. She had moved. She was standing directly beside the stool now, her back to the hall, facing the staff table. That is what the basin is designed to do. It does not merely identify compounds. It identifies the magical signatures of the individuals who administered them. She held up her quill parchment. I have the results. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. The earlier silence had been shock. This one was wait. Dumbledore looked at the parchment. He did not look at Harry. I would suggest, he said, very quietly, that this is a conversation better suited to my office, where, you would suggest, McGonagall said, and her voice had dropped to a register that made the candles flicker, a private conversation. About 52 active magical compounds in an 11-year-old child. In your office. Minerva, don't. The word landed like a door slamming. Don't you Minerva me right now. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger was watching Harry Potter with an expression of such fierce, focused attention that the boy beside her had edged away slightly. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was watching with his mouth very slightly open, which was the most undone he had looked all evening. Professor Snape was sitting completely still, both hands flat on the table, and staring at the diagnostic parchment in Pomfrey's hand with an expression that could have been read as many things but which was, if you looked carefully, the specific stillness of a man forcing himself not to react to something that is costing him enormously not to react to. And Harry Potter, still standing beside the stool, reached out and picked up the sorting hat. He didn't put it on his head. He just held it. Looked at it. How much of who I am, he said, is actually mine? He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you say something when you've been building toward it for a while without knowing it. But in the silence of the great hall, it carried perfectly. The hat, to the shock of absolutely everyone, answered him. More than they hoped, it said. Less than you deserve. But it's still there, boy. Underneath all of it. The rest is, well. The rest is what was done to you. Harry looked at the hat for a long moment. Then he set it back on the stool. He turned to face the staff table, not with the nervous, floor-examining energy he'd brought into the hall, but with his chin level and his eyes on Dumbledore, direct and clear and completely without performance. I'd like to know, Harry said, who signed the parchment. Pomfrey glanced at her results. Back at Harry. She had the expression of someone watching a locked door swing open on its own. The primary signature on 49 of the 52 compounds, she said carefully, belongs to, it's all right. Harry's voice was steady. Remarkably steady for someone who had just been told that his entire personality might be a pharmaceutical product. You can say it. Pomfrey straightened. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The name landed in the hall like a dropped stone. One of the first-year girls near the back of the line started crying quietly. Several older students were already on their feet. The Weasley twins, who had been characteristically silent for the last 4 minutes, were staring at each other with matching expressions of something that had moved well past their usual impish register into something raw and real. Percy Weasley was sitting rigidly upright with the specific posture of someone who has just been told that everything they've structured their life around requires re-examination. Ron Weasley, still in the first-year line, was staring at Harry with his mouth open and his freckles standing out sharp against skin that had gone pale. Dumbledore had not moved. His hands were still folded. The warm light in his eyes had not dimmed. And that specific, deliberate warmth, maintained in this moment of all moments, was somehow the worst thing in the room. Harry, he said, gentle as ever. I know this is frightening. What you're seeing, what you think you understand, I promise you, there is a much larger picture. Who held the remaining 3? Harry asked. Not to Dumbledore. To Pomfrey. She checked her parchment. The quill in her hand had stopped moving. 2 signatures are unknown and will require further forensic analysis. The 3rd, she stopped. Pomfrey. His voice was patient. The 3rd signature belongs to Petunia Dursley, née Evans. And that was the thing that broke through whatever control Harry had been exercising over his own face, because of course it was his aunt. Of course it reached into the one place he hadn't fully armored in the last 10 minutes. His jaw tightened. His hands curled at his sides. Something moved through his expression fast as weather and then was gone, replaced by a composure that looked almost inhuman on an 11-year-old face. Almost. Right, he said. Quietly. McGonagall had her hand over her mouth. It was a small gesture, controlled, but it was there, and on Minerva McGonagall it was the equivalent of someone else dissolving entirely. Madame Pomfrey, Harry said, turning to her. What happens to the compounds now? Now that the diagnostic has identified them. The diagnostic process itself begins to destabilize active compounds, she said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone giving a patient information they need and not softening it. The potions already began breaking down the moment the rod identified them. The process will complete over the next 24 to 48 hours, during which you may experience pain. Discomfort. Disorientation. Emotional shifts. Right. He nodded. Then, almost to himself, good. The 52 ribbons of magical residue were still turning slowly around him. They had begun to thin at their edges, the compounds destabilizing exactly as Pomfrey described. They looked like smoke caught in a shaft of light, still present but already losing density, already beginning to dissolve back into nothing. Harry watched them go the way you watch the last of something. Then he looked back at the great hall, at 400 students watching him with everything from horror to fascination to grief, and he said, with a calm that was either extraordinary or simply the eye of a storm, I assume I still need to be sorted. Nobody laughed. But 3 people almost did, in the helpless way you almost laugh at funerals when someone says something exactly right. McGonagall crossed the hall to him. She didn't stride, she moved, quickly and directly, and when she reached him she put her hand on his shoulder, and her voice was pitched for him alone. You don't have to. Not tonight. I can take you to the hospital wing, I want to. His voice was quiet but there was nothing yielding in it. I want to do at least one thing tonight that's mine. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was working hard at holding itself together. She stepped back. Gestured to the stool. Harry sat down. Picked up the sorting hat. Placed it on his head. The hat was quiet for a moment. Then it said, in a voice that carried easily through the silence, remarkable. Most students have only one self for me to sort. You've been carrying at least 4 different ones. A pause. Let me find the real one. Nobody in the hall breathed. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. At the 4-minute mark, Dumbledore shifted in his seat, a barely perceptible movement, but it was there, and Snape, who had been watching the headmaster the way a hawk watches a field, registered it. At the 5-minute mark, the hat spoke. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table reacted, but not with the usual roar. It was something more complicated than that, something that started with 2 or 3 people and rippled outward and became something between a cheer and an ovation and something else entirely, something that had tears in it and couldn't quite decide what it was. Percy Weasley was clapping with painful precision. The twins were standing. Hermione Granger was already moving down the bench to make room with the focused efficiency of someone who had already decided certain things. Harry took the hat off his head, set it on the stool, and stood up. He walked to the Gryffindor table without rushing. Sat down next to Hermione, who had wedged a gap for him with her elbows. She didn't say anything right away. She just handed him a bread roll from the basket in front of her, and he took it, and that small ordinary transaction in the middle of the most extraordinary moment of either of their lives was somehow the most human thing that had happened in the last 20 minutes. You're okay, Hermione said quietly. It wasn't really a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. I have no idea, Harry said honestly. He ate the roll. Behind them, at the staff table, Dumbledore rose from his seat for the first time. Students. His voice rang through the hall with its customary warmth, its customary authority. The room's attention snapped to him with years of conditioned reflex, and even now, it worked, and that working was its own kind of horror for everyone who caught themselves doing it. What we have witnessed tonight is unexpected and, I want to assure you, already being addressed by appropriate authorities. I would ask all students to return to their dormitories in an orderly fashion. The feast will be rescheduled, no. McGonagall said it from where she was standing, very still, at the end of the staff table. Dumbledore paused. The feast, she said, will continue. The students will remain here. And you, Albus, will sit back down and you will not speak again tonight until you are spoken to. She turned to the hall. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Prefects, please see to your first years. The sorting will resume in 5 minutes. There was a beat, long, weighted, historic, in which Albus Dumbledore stood at the head of his staff table and considered what had just happened to his authority. He sat down. And Minerva McGonagall walked to the stone basin, picked up the diagnostic parchment from Madame Pomfrey's hand, and tucked it into her robes with the precise, deliberate motion of someone taking custody of a weapon. The sorting resumed. Harry Potter ate his bread roll and watched the remaining first years go up to the hat, one by one, their diagnostic rods glowing simple, uncomplicated amber, their faces bright with the ordinary terror of ordinary children at the start of an ordinary year. He watched them with something that wasn't quite envy because it was too new and too sore to have a name yet. Hermione's knee was pressed against his under the table. He didn't think she was aware of it. He didn't move away. At the staff table, Snape had picked up his goblet but was not drinking from it. He was looking at his own hands. His face was doing several things at once, and none of them were the cold disdain that his students knew and various colleagues feared. He looked, in this moment, like a man sitting inside a revelation that he had been circling for years without ever letting himself land. He looked like a man realizing that the worst thing he had suspected was true, and that he had known it, in some chamber of himself, and had chosen not to look directly at it, because looking would have required him to act. He set the goblet down. He looked at Harry Potter across the great hall. Harry, as though he felt it, glanced up. Their eyes met for the first time. Snape looked away first. The feast that filled the tables when the sorting concluded was the same as it always was, the same roast chickens and treacle tarts and pumpkin juice and everything else that Hogwarts laid on every September 1st, but it didn't feel the same. It tasted the same, probably, but there was a quality to the eating that was different, as though the food had been placed in front of people who were performing the act of having dinner while actually doing something else entirely. Conversations moved in tight, low clusters. The older students were recalibrating everything they knew about the last decade. The first years were trying to understand what they had walked into. The second years were too young to have context and too old to ask questions. At the Gryffindor table, Percy had migrated down from the prefect end and was sitting across from Harry with his hands folded and an expression of rigid correctness that was doing a poor job of containing the fact that he was shaken straight through to his spine. "I'm Percy Weasley," he said, as though the Weasley twins on either side of Harry hadn't already said everything Percy was now unable to say. "Percy Weasley, prefect, we know who you are, Perce," said Fred, or George. "You've introduced yourself to Harry twice in the last 10 minutes. "I'm establishing, you're vibrating slightly," said the other one. Ron Weasley, who had been sorted into Gryffindor at some point during the last 40 minutes in a moment that Harry had been too occupied with the inside of his own skull to properly register, was sitting at the end of the bench watching Harry with the expression of someone desperately wanting to say the right thing and utterly unsure what that was. "I'm Ron," he said finally. "We met on the train, kind of, well, you walked past our compartment and Fred said," he stopped. Started again. "That was really, you were really," he gave up entirely on sentences. "Blimey. Eloquent," said Fred. "Deep," said George. Harry looked at Ron and thought, in some half-formed way that he couldn't yet articulate, that there was something very genuine about a person who swore off elegance entirely when they didn't know what to say. "Thanks," he said, which wasn't quite a response to anything Ron had said but seemed to cover it. Neville Longbottom, 3 seats down, was eating with his head bent low over his plate. He had been quiet since his own diagnostic, which everyone else had already half forgotten in the wake of what came after. Harry had not forgotten it. He'd watched the dark purple pulse in the core of the crystal, and he'd seen Pomfrey's note, and he thought about it now. "Neville," he said. Neville looked up. He had the cautious expression of someone who had been startled too many times. "It pulsed," Harry said quietly. "Just to him. In your diagnostic. I saw it." Neville's fork stopped moving. "You don't have to tell me what it was," Harry said. "I just wanted you to know I saw it. A beat. And I don't think it was nothing." Something in Neville's face went through a rapid sequence of changes, shock, then the involuntary opening of something long kept shut, then something very close to relief, and then he nodded, once, and looked back at his plate, and went back to eating. But his shoulders had dropped about an inch. Hermione, who had heard all of this, looked at Harry sideways. "How are you doing that?" she said quietly. "Doing what?" "Being," she gestured vaguely. "You." "I have no idea," Harry said again, and ate a piece of chicken. "I'm not sure I've done it before." At the head of the hall, Dumbledore sat in his chair and spoke to no one, and ate nothing, and looked out over his school with an expression that could have been mistaken for serenity unless you knew how to read it, and Minerva McGonagall knew how to read it, and what it said was not serenity at all. It was the look of a man running the calculations. Measuring the distances. Deciding which moves were still available. She watched him do it and felt something go cold in her chest. She had known this man for 40 years. She had trusted him with things that could not be untrusted. She had carried his instructions and enforced his decisions and believed, with the specific faith of someone who has chosen to believe because the alternative requires remaking yourself from the ground up, she had believed that he was what he said he was. She pressed the diagnostic parchment against her ribs and thought about the 11-year-old boy sitting at the Gryffindor table eating a piece of chicken with the composure of someone who has just been told they have never truly existed, and she thought about what she was going to do with the next 24 hours. A great deal, she decided. She was going to do a great deal. Down the table, Phileas Flitwick sat very quietly and did not eat. He was doing arithmetic in his head, dates and dosages and access points and the specific question of when and how and who knew, and every answer kept coming back to the same place, and the same person, and every time it did, he felt the small, precise grief of a man whose highest estimation of another human being has just been definitively recalculated. He made a mental note to contact Amelia Bones in the morning. The feast ended the way feasts always ended, not all at once but in pieces, students drifting out in clusters, the noise level dropping in irregular stages, the torches along the walls burning lower. The first years were collected by their prefects and led to their dormitories through the castle's shifting corridors, and most of them were too overwhelmed to appreciate the moving portraits and the trick staircases and all the other particular magic of Hogwarts that made first nights so memorable. Harry followed the Gryffindor prefect, a sixth-year girl with a prefect badge and the expression of someone trying very hard to project normalcy, up through the castle. The other first-year Gryffindors clustered around him in an orbit of collective unsureness. Nobody knew quite how to arrange themselves around this particular evening, so they didn't, and the walk up to the tower was mostly quiet. The fat lady swung open to Percy's password and they filed into the common room. It was exactly as it should be, red and gold and warm, with the fire already burning in the grate, the battered armchairs and the long windows and the sense of a room that had held 100 years of students and would hold 100 more. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt something he couldn't name. "Are you all right?" Hermione was at his elbow. She had a knack for appearing precisely when she was needed and not a moment before, which Harry was already beginning to recognize as one of her defining characteristics. "I keep being asked that," he said. "Because people keep meaning it." He looked at the fire. "I keep waiting for something to hit me," he said. "Like, I know what happened. I understand what Pomfrey said. 52 compounds. 10 years. Dumbledore." He said the name flatly. "I understand it. But it hasn't, it doesn't feel real yet. It's like reading about something terrible in a book." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "That might be the last of the potions," she said carefully. "Emotional suppression draft was on the list. If it hasn't fully worn off, I know." He sat down in one of the armchairs by the fire. The flames were orange and ordinary and warm. She said 24 to 48 hours. "Then tomorrow might be harder." "Yeah." He leaned back. "Yeah, it might." She sat in the chair across from him and opened a book, the same thick volume she'd had on the train, something about the history of Hogwarts, and didn't say anything else. She just sat there, reading, with the specific quality of someone who has made a decision to be present without demanding that presence be acknowledged. It was, Harry would later think, one of the kindest things anyone had ever done for him, and it cost her nothing, and she didn't even know she was doing it. He looked up at the ceiling. Somewhere in this castle, a man who had shaped the last decade of his life was sitting in his office doing calculations. Harry was not afraid. He thought about that. He should have been, probably. He was 11, and he was alone, and the person who had done this was also the most powerful wizard alive. He turned the fear over in his mind, looking for it, checking the corners. It wasn't there. What was there, underneath the emotional suppression draft's fading residue, beginning to press up through the surface like something long submerged, was anger. Clear, cold, specific anger. The kind that doesn't shake or shout, but that knows exactly what it wants. He wasn't afraid of Albus Dumbledore. He was done with him. "Hermione," he said. She looked up from her book. "How do you file a formal magical complaint with the Wizengamot?" She stared at him for exactly 1 second. Then she closed the history of Hogwarts, reached into her bag, and pulled out a different book entirely. "I was wondering when you'd ask that," she said, and began to read. Chapter 2, The weight of knowing the hospital wing at 2 in the morning had a specific quality of silence that was different from everywhere else in the castle. It wasn't peaceful, exactly. It was the silence of a place where things happened to people, and the walls had absorbed all of it over a very long time, and now the quiet itself felt like it had weight. Harry lay in the third bed from the left with a thin white curtain drawn around him and stared at the ceiling. The last of the emotional suppression draft had broken down at 11:47. He knew the exact time because Madame Pomfrey had been checking his vitals every hour and she had noted the moment on her parchment with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and she had looked at his face when it happened and said, very quietly, "I'll give you some privacy," and pulled the curtain and left him alone. That had been 2 hours ago. He hadn't cried. He'd thought he might, had felt the pressure of it building and building as the draft cleared his system, a chemical tide going out and leaving the shoreline of himself exposed for the first time. But what came up when it finally broke wasn't tears. It was something older and quieter and more fundamental than grief. It was rage. Not hot rage. Not the kind that breaks things. The kind that settles into your bones and changes their composition, that makes you feel extremely, completely, and irrevocably awake. He lay on the hospital bed and let it move through him and did not fight it and did not amplify it and simply allowed it to be what it was, because for the first time in his life his feelings were entirely his own and that, even that feeling, even that specific quality of fury, was in some terrible way a relief. He thought about the Dursleys' house. The cupboard under the stairs, which he'd slept in until he was 9 and which still smelled, in his memory, of dust and the underside of the first step. He thought about the birthday cards that never came and the Christmases that moved around him like weather that didn't include him. He thought about how he'd always been slightly too grateful for small kindnesses, a plate of food left out, a teacher who said his name without contempt, and he understood now why that specific shape of gratitude had always felt strange, like a coat cut for someone smaller. He'd been made pliable. Made soft at the edges. Made into the kind of boy who would accept whatever he was given and not reach for more. He pressed his hands flat on the bed and breathed through his nose and thought, no more. The curtain moved. He expected Pomfrey. It was not Pomfrey. Professor McGonagall stood at the gap in the curtain with her tartan dressing gown over her robes. She clearly had not been to bed, and a tray with 2 cups of tea. She looked at him for a moment and something in her face worked briefly and unsuccessfully at composure. "May I come in?" she said. Harry sat up. "It's your hospital wing. It's Poppy's hospital wing. I'm just a guest." She came in anyway, set the tray on the bedside table, pulled the chair around, and sat down with the posture of someone who has made a decision and is going to see it through regardless of what it costs them. She handed him a cup of tea. He took it. For a while neither of them said anything. The tea was very hot and exactly right, the kind of thing that existed in a register below thought. "How much did you know?" Harry asked. He didn't make it an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked the way you ask questions when you actually want the answer. McGonagall wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Nothing," she said. "And that is," she stopped. I have been trying to decide, for the last 4 hours, whether nothing is an excuse or an indictment. She looked at the curtain. I suspect it is both. You're not the one who did it. No. But I placed you with those people. Her voice did not crack, but it did the thing that voices do just before they crack. It went very controlled and very precise. 11 years ago, Albus told me the Dursleys were the best option for your safety. He had reasons. He always has reasons. She stopped again. I didn't ask enough questions. Harry looked at his tea. Would asking questions have changed anything? She opened her mouth. Closed it. That specific honesty was another kind of grief. I don't know. Perhaps not. He is, and here something crossed her face that was not anger and was not admiration and was somewhere between them where complicated feelings live, extraordinarily good at what he does. At lying? At believing himself, she said. There is a difference. Liars know what they're doing. Albus, she shook her head. He has convinced himself that every decision was made for your benefit. That the potions were protective. That the compulsions kept you from drawing attention, from pushing back against people who might have hurt you, she pressed her lips together. He has a story for every single one of those 52 compounds, and in every story he is the careful guardian and you are the fragile thing he was preserving. Harry looked at her steadily. And what are you? The person who should have looked harder. She held his gaze. I am sorry, Harry. I am profoundly sorry. And I understand if that means very little to you right now. He thought about it. Genuinely turned it over, which was something the old Harry, the potion Harry, would not have done. He would have accepted the apology reflexively, would have said it's all right because that was the shape of the response he'd been built to give. Instead he sat with it and found that it did mean something, that it meant something specific because it was real, and because she wasn't asking him for anything in return. It means something, he said. Not enough to fix anything. But something. She nodded once, like a judge registering a verdict. What happens now? He asked. Several things. She set her cup down and straightened slightly, McGonagall coming back to herself, which meant the part of herself that organized and moved and acted. Phileas, Professor Flitwick, sent a message to Madame Bones at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at approximately 9:30 this evening. She will likely arrive tomorrow. The diagnostic record is evidential under wizarding law, the Basin signatures are magically unimpeachable, which means they cannot be disputed in a formal inquest. Who is Amelia Bones? Head of the DMLE. She is honest. McGonagall said it the way you note a rare thing. Genuinely, consistently honest, which in the ministry is not as common as you'd hope. She lost family to Voldemort. A beat. She has no reason to protect Dumbledore. Harry filed this away. And Dumbledore? What is he doing right now? McGonagall's expression did something complicated. He is, I believe, in his office. Severus went to speak with him an hour ago. Something sharpened in Harry's attention. Snape? Yes. What for? She looked at him for a moment, deciding something. Before I answer that, do you know anything about Severus Snape? Beyond the name? He was on the parchment, Harry said. He wasn't one of the 52. But he was watching the diagnostic like he already knew something. McGonagall looked faintly startled. You noticed that? I notice things. Then, after a moment, I think I always did. I think I just wasn't allowed to do anything about it. The silence that fell after that sat between them like a third person in the room. She told him about Snape then, in the edited, professional way of a teacher describing a colleague, not the full story, but enough, potions master, long history with Dumbledore, complicated allegiances, reliable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. She did not tell him about Lily Potter, because that wasn't her story to tell and she knew it. Harry listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities, really listening, not waiting for space to respond. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He looked away first," Harry said. McGonagall blinked. "I'm sorry." "When we made eye contact in the Great Hall. He looked away first." Harry turned his cup in his hands. "I want to know why." "Perhaps guilt. Maybe. Or shame, which is different." He looked at her. "I'm not going to be managed, Professor. Not by anyone. I want you to know that up front. Not by Dumbledore, not by the Ministry, not by anyone who decides they know what's best for me better than I do." She looked at him, this thin 11-year-old in a hospital gown who had been chemically suppressed for a decade and had been awake for his actual self for approximately 3 hours, and she made a decision about him that she would not revisit. "Understood," she said. "For what it's worth, I don't want to manage you. I want to help you. Those are different things." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'll hold you to that." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to her face, but it was there in her eyes, and it was real. "You should sleep," she said, standing. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you need to be rested for it." "Will Dumbledore try to," he searched for the word. "Do anything? Tonight?" "He won't make a move tonight," she said, with the certainty of someone who has watched a particular chess player for 40 years. "He'll gather. He'll plan. He's many things, but he's not reckless." She picked up the tray. "I'll be outside the wing for the next few hours." "You don't have to, I know I don't have to." She said it without sharpness. "I want to." She paused at the curtain. "Harry. The diagnostic record, Pomfrey made 3 copies. One is with me. One is already at the Ministry. One is, somewhere Albus cannot reach it." She looked at him. "I want you to know it exists. That it can't be unmade." Harry looked at her for a moment. "Thank you." She left. He lay back on the bed and listened to the hospital wing breathe around him and thought about 10 years of potions breaking down in his bloodstream, and about a cupboard under the stairs, and about a man who had a story for every single one. He thought about Hermione's book on Wisengamot procedures, which he'd read 3 chapters of before Pomfrey had come to collect him for overnight monitoring. He thought about what Hermione had said about the age of majority and magical emancipation and the rights of a minor ward under the Wisengamot's protective statutes. He thought, first things first. Then he closed his eyes and, against all probability, slept. The corridors of Hogwarts at 4 in the morning were dark and restless in the specific way they got when something had disturbed the castle's equilibrium. The portraits murmured between frames. The staircases shifted more than usual. A suit of armor near the 3rd floor had turned itself around to face the wall, which it did sometimes when it was anxious about something, and nobody had ever entirely figured out why. Severus Snape walked back from the headmaster's office with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into careful blankness and his mind running hot and fast through everything that had happened and everything that had been said. The meeting with Dumbledore had been instructive. That was the word he was using for it. He had sat in the chair across from the headmaster's desk and listened to the old man talk, and Albus had been extraordinary at it, had been warm and regretful and full of such genuine, articulate sorrow for the necessity of what he'd done, had explained the reasoning behind each potion with the patient clarity of a physician explaining a difficult treatment. The prophecy. Voldemort. The need for a willing sacrifice, a boy who would walk into death without flinching. You could not have that from a boy who knew what he was walking toward. You needed a boy who had been shaped to give himself up. It was, Dumbledore had explained, mercy. The kindest thing for everyone. Snape had listened to all of it and had not said a single word. He'd been thinking about Lily. Not about Lily and James, not about the complicated, decades-old wreck of that particular emotional history, but about Lily specifically, about the last conversation he'd had with her, about her eyes and Harry's eyes being the same shape and color and the specific quality of grief that Snape had been carrying since October of 1981 and which he had converted, over the years, into the most efficient fuel available, relentless, precise action. He had agreed to spy. He had agreed to protect. He had never agreed to this. He turned the corner and stopped. McGonagall was sitting in a chair outside the hospital wing with a cup of tea and a stack of parchment and the look of a woman who had decided to hold a position. They looked at each other. "Minerva," he said. "Severus." He walked to her and stood with his arms folded. "You're keeping watch." "Apparently." "Do you think he stopped." The sentence wanted to end in a dozen different ways and none of them were things he wanted to say out loud at 4 in the morning in a hospital corridor. "No," she said, which addressed all dozen endings at once. "He wouldn't. Not directly. Not with me here." She looked at him. "How was he?" Snape was quiet for a moment. "Eloquent," he said, and the word landed with everything he was not saying under it. McGonagall's jaw tightened. "Did he explain?" "At length." "And?" Snape looked at the hospital wing door. "The child's been dosed with Fealty's foundation since before he could walk. 3 drops in his formula every morning for the first 2 years, apparently administered via the Dursley woman, who was told it was a vitamin supplement. He said this very flatly. Then imperative warmth compound, the kind typically used on adults in witness protection programs, not on 6-year-olds, added at the start of primary school. Then the first loyalty compound at age 8. Then the suppression draft at 9. He paused. He built a pharmaceutical architecture in the boy over a decade. Every compound was chosen specifically. The loyalty potions layer, each one reinforcing the others. They were designed to create, as Albus described it, profound trust in established authority. Specifically Dumbledore's own authority. McGonagall's teacup had stopped moving halfway to her mouth. He said it with such, Snape searched for the word. Clarity. There was no shame in it. He explained it as you would explain a building project. This foundation here, this supporting wall there. He unfolded his arms and put his hands in his pockets. I have made a great many choices I am not proud of. I would not have done this. I know, she said quietly. The blood curse is the worst of it. His voice dropped. The blood loyalty curse is not a potion. You cannot administer it in a formula or a meal. It requires physical contact. And specific intent. A beat. It's rooted in the boy's magic itself. In the seat of his power. It was designed to cap his magical output, prevent him from accessing his full ability until, he stopped. McGonagall set down her teacup. Until what? Snape's jaw worked briefly. Until the final confrontation with the Dark Lord. At which point the curse would break, releasing his full power into a single terminal event. He looked at her and his expression was, for once, stripped of every professional layer. He was engineering the boy's death, Minerva. A beautiful, heroic, willing death. Built to specification. The corridor was very quiet. McGonagall stood up. Go to bed, Severus, she said. Her voice was completely steady in the way that completely steady voices are sometimes more alarming than shouts. You've told me what I needed to know. Go to bed. And you? I'm staying here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and his footsteps were measured and even, and only someone who knew him well would have noticed that they were slightly faster than usual. McGonagall sat back down in her chair, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the wall opposite. After a while she picked up her quill and her parchment and began to write a letter. It was a long letter. It was the most carefully worded thing she had written in 40 years of teaching, and she wrote it in the specific way you write things when you understand that every word will matter and none of them can be taken back, and when she finished it she sealed it with her own magical signature and set it aside and started a second one. Inside the hospital wing, Harry Potter slept deeply and without dreams, which Pomfrey would note in the morning as a significant indicator, because the emotional suppression draft typically caused severe nightmares during its breakdown phase, and the fact that he was sleeping cleanly suggested something about the structure of the boy's mind that she filed away to think about properly when she had time. He did not dream. He was too busy, somewhere in the deeper currents of consciousness, coming back to himself. Morning arrived at Hogwarts with the specific rudeness that September mornings in Scotland had perfected, grey light and brisk cold and a sky the colour of old pewter pressing down on the lake. The owls were coming back from their night runs, trading places with each other in the Ollery with the efficient chaos of a postal sorting office. The kitchens had been producing breakfast since 5, and the smell of it was drifting up through the castle in a way that was almost aggressively ordinary given everything. Harry woke at 6:30. He lay still for a moment and took inventory, the way you do after something has changed and you need to map the new territory. The draft residue was mostly gone, he could feel its absence as a kind of clarity, a sharpness at the edges of things. His thoughts felt like his own in a way that he was still adjusting to, the same way you adjust to silence after a long noise. He sat up. Madame Pomfrey appeared through the curtain with the promptness of someone who had been listening for exactly that sound. "Good morning. How do you feel?" "Clear," he said. Like I've been looking at everything through dirty glass and someone just," he gestured. "The suppression draft is fully metabolized." She checked his pulse, pressed 2 fingers to his temple and muttered something diagnostic, checked the result. "The loyalty compounds are down to trace levels, they'll be gone by tomorrow. The memory modification compounds will take the longest, possibly 3 to 4 days, but they're degrading cleanly." She made a note. "You may experience recovered memories over the next week as those clear. Things you saw or heard that were suppressed or altered. I want to warn you about that so you're not blindsided," he said. "Yes. All right." He thought about this. "How bad?" She looked at him carefully, the way she'd been looking at him since last night, like she was making constant, rolling assessments. "That depends entirely on what was suppressed," she said honestly. "I can't tell you the content, only the mechanism." "I'm sorry." "Right." He swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Can I leave? I'd like to keep you for the morning. I need to be in the Great Hall." She opened her mouth. "Madame Pomfrey." He looked at her, not defiantly, but directly, with the specific quality of someone who has decided that they have opinions about their own life that they intend to express. "I understand you want to monitor me and I understand why, and I think you're excellent at your job. But I need to be in the Great Hall when the post comes because I sent 3 letters last night and I need to see if anyone responds." She stared at him. "You sent letters? Last night? From the hospital wing?" The window opens. She stared at him for a moment longer. "What did you send?" "One to the Daily Prophet. One to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. One to Gringotts Bank." He said it with the same calm with which he'd asked for bread on the train, and the same calm with which he'd asked about Wisingamot procedures at midnight, and Pomfrey had the sudden, vivid impression of a boy who had been kept very small and very still for a very long time and was now, incrementally and deliberately, refusing to stay that way. She sat down on the end of the bed. "Harry. The ministry letter, Madame Bones is already coming, Flitwick, I know. That's not what I wrote to the DMLE. He looked at her. "I wrote to the Aura Department. Specifically about my godfather." Her expression shifted. "Sirius Black. He was convicted of murdering 13 people and betraying my parents," Harry said. "I read about him in a history of modern magic, which was in the Hogwarts welcome package Granger apparently read cover to cover on the train." He paused. "The book says he was convicted. It doesn't say he had a trial." Pomfrey was quiet. "He didn't, did he?" Harry said. "Not a question." "No," she said, very carefully. He did not. The expression on Harry's face went through a small, controlled sequence. I wrote to the Auror department to request the formal record of his arrest and commitment to Azkaban. I have the right to request those records as his godson. It's in Hermione's, in the Wisengamot Statutes book. Next of kin and assigned wards have archival access rights. He looked at her steadily. If there's no trial record, that means he's been in Azkaban for 10 years without a conviction. That is, yes. Technically, that is what it means. Then I want him out, Harry said. Simply. Completely. That's not complicated. Pomfrey pressed her lips together. She had 30 years of experience at staying neutral on things that weren't medical, and this was genuinely testing it. The Gringotts letter. My accounts. My inheritance. My status. He met her eyes. I need to know what Dumbledore had access to. She closed her eyes briefly. You think he had 52 active compounds in my body and a blood curse on my magic, Harry said. I think it would be naive to assume he stopped there. She opened her eyes. She looked at the boy in front of her, clear-eyed, steady, methodical at 11 years old, which was either a sign of extraordinary natural capability finally unshackled or the most quietly heartbreaking thing she'd seen in 30 years of watching children come through this castle, probably both. You can go to the Great Hall, she said. I'll do a final check at noon. And Harry, she stopped him as he started to slide off the bed. Eat something. The purge of that many compounds has metabolic consequences. Don't skip breakfast. He paused. Looked at her. And something moved across his face that was less composed than the rest of the morning, quick and young and almost startled, the look of a boy who had been told to eat something with what amounted to affection and didn't quite know what to do with it yet. I won't, he said. Thank you, Madame Pomfrey. She waved him off and did not watch him go because she was already reaching for her own quill and parchment, and the letter she was going to write was going to say several things in very plain language to the British Medical Registry of Magical Compounds, and it was going to have her full name on it, and she was going to mean every word. The Great Hall at breakfast was nothing like the Great Hall at dinner. It was louder in the wrong places and quieter in others, and the morning light came through the enchanted ceiling in low September rays that made everything look slightly unfinished. Students who had been awake too late trading theories about last night's events had the specific look of people who were too tired to pretend they weren't staring. Harry walked in and the staring happened immediately and universally, and he walked through it the way you walk through wind, acknowledging its presence without being moved by it, and sat down next to Hermione, who had already been there for half an hour. She had 2 books open, a plate of toast that she'd been eating with one hand, and a neatly organized series of notes that she had clearly been constructing since before the sun was up. She looked up when he sat down and looked at him in that sharp, assessing way she had. You look different, she said. I feel different. Good different? Yes, he said, and picked up a piece of toast. Mostly. She studied him for a moment longer and then nodded, accepting this, and pushed her notes toward him. I found the Emancipation Statute. It's Section 47 of the Wizarding Minor Protections Act. If a minor can demonstrate that their established guardianship has been used to cause magical harm, they can petition the Wisengamot for. I sent letters this morning, Harry said. She stopped. You, Gringotts, the DMLE, and the Prophet. She stared at him. Something behind her eyes was rapidly recalibrating. The Prophet? To put them on notice that a statement is coming, he said, eating his toast. So that if Dumbledore tries to bury it, there's already a flag. He looked at her. Is that wrong? No, she said, and he could see her slotting this into whatever model of him she was building. That's very good. She paused. What did you say to the Prophet exactly? I told them that I, Harry James Potter, would be making a public statement regarding my medical treatment under the guardianship arrangements established by Albus Dumbledore, and that I would appreciate journalistic awareness of the story's public interest dimensions. He paused. I used Hermione's Wiesengemot book to check the wording. Hermione was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't fully categorize. It was warm and slightly stunned and something else, something that was maybe the look of someone recognizing a person for the first time after a long period of only seeing a surface. You don't need to keep calling it Hermione's book, she said. It's your book now. I'll get you your own copy. I appreciate that. Neville appeared across from them, toad in pocket, looking like he'd slept approximately as well as Harry had. He sat down and began loading his plate with mechanical efficiency. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, my Gran's going to hear about last night. Yes, Harry said. She'll, Neville stopped, poked at a sausage. She's going to say it was necessary. Whatever Dumbledore did. She's going to say, she's going to have a reason. Probably, Harry agreed. Neville looked at him. Doesn't that bother you? When people have a reason? It used to, Harry said. I think it used to bother me a lot. Now I think, he considered it. I think having a reason doesn't make something right. It just means you put thought into doing it. He looked at Neville steadily. What pulsed in your diagnostic last night? You don't have to tell me. Neville was quiet for a moment. Around them the breakfast noise went on, plates and conversation and the sound of the morning running its ordinary course. It's called a diminishment compound, Neville said, very quietly. I looked it up in the library last year. It suppresses magical confidence. Makes you believe you're weaker than you are. He said this to his plate. My Gran said it was for my protection. That if I didn't know how strong I was, I wouldn't do anything reckless. Harry looked at him. She meant well, Neville said, and the phrase came out with the specific automaticity of something that had been said many times, a groove worn into language by repetition. You don't have to defend her to me, Harry said. Neville looked up. I'm not going to tell you she's terrible. I'm not going to tell you what to feel about her. Harry held his gaze. I'm just going to say that what was done to you matters. The reason doesn't fix the doing. Neville held his gaze for a long moment. Something was happening in his face, the slow opening of something, the careful removal of a load-bearing assumption. She put it in my pumpkin juice, he said. Every morning. Then you should talk to Pomfrey. Will you? He stopped. Yes, Harry said, before he'd finished. I'll go with you. Neville nodded. Once. And went back to his breakfast with slightly less mechanical efficiency, as though something had been set down somewhere inside him. The owl post arrived at 8:30. Harry had been waiting for it without obviously waiting for it, which was a skill he apparently possessed naturally and which the potions had never managed to suppress entirely. When the great wave of owls came banking through the high windows he was watching, and he picked out his 3 birds by their return stamps, a large Gringotts owl first, then a smaller ministry bird, then a third he didn't recognize. The Gringotts letter landed in front of him with a heavy thud. The ministry letter followed, more precise in its landing. The third, the unknown owl, a sharp-eyed tawny, dropped a letter directly on his plate and left without waiting for a response. He looked at the 3 envelopes. Hermione was looking at them too, her toast forgotten. He opened the Gringotts one first. The parchment was thick and cream-colored and covered in script that had the particular formal elegance of goblin-drafted legal correspondence, correct, thorough, and carrying underneath its politeness the specific energy of an institution that had been waiting for this conversation. Dear Mr. Potter, it began. We received your inquiry with considerable interest. A full accounting of the Potter vaults, including a record of all authorized withdrawals, access grants, and trust fund management decisions made since November 1, 1981, is attached herein. We note that your inquiry aligns with certain internal discrepancies that our auditors flagged in 1987 and again in 1992 that have thus far remained unaddressed. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss these matters at your earliest convenience. Harry turned over the first page. The attached account record was 15 pages long. Hermione made a sound. How bad, he said, not yet looking at the numbers. There are, she was reading over his shoulder, running her finger down the columns. Harry, there are 63 withdrawals from your trust fund over the last 10 years. All authorized under Dumbledore's signature as your guardian. She stopped at one entry and her voice went tight. 14,000 galleons to the Hogwarts Discretionary Fund. Is that a real thing? I don't know. She straightened up. Her jaw was set. We're going to find out. He set the Gringotts letter aside and opened the Ministry one. The DMLE response was signed by a junior clerk and was cautiously worded to a degree that approached art, but its substance was clear. His request for the record of Sirius Black's arrest and commitment had been received and processed, and in accordance with archival access rights under Section 12 of the Wisengamot Protections Act, the relevant record was enclosed. He looked at the enclosed record. It was exactly as short as he'd suspected. 4 lines. Arrest date. Commitment date. Charge. Azkaban assignment. No trial date. No trial proceedings. No verdict because there had been no trial, just a man taken from a street in London and put on a boat and dropped behind the worst magical barrier in Britain without anyone asking whether he'd done what they said. Harry read the 4 lines twice, folded the parchment very neatly, and put it in his inner pocket. He opened the 3rd letter last. It was handwritten. No letterhead. The script was narrow and precise and slightly forward-leaning, like someone who was used to writing quickly. Potter. I know what you did last night before Pomfrey took you to the wing. The 3 letters. The window. I know because if I'd been you, I'd have done the same, which tells me something useful about both of us. I've been watching Albus operate for 20 years. I know how he moves. He will begin building a containment narrative today, sympathetic framing, context setting, the public relations version of what happened that presents his actions as regrettable but necessary. He'll have the prophet working on it by noon if he hasn't already. Your letter to them was the right instinct. Act faster. Harry looked at the bottom of the letter. SS, P.S. You should read Compound Magics and Long-Term Potions Administration by Ragnhild Astisardottir, 5th shelf, Potions section, Library. You'll want to understand what was done to you in your own words, not Pomfrey's or mine. I find it's better to be equipped. Harry sat with the letter for a moment. Then he folded it. Put it in his other inner pocket. More actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 3, The Sovereign. The library opened at 8, and Harry was there at 8:01. The Hogwarts library at that hour had the particular quality of a place that had not yet decided to be occupied, chairs still tucked in, the morning light coming through the high windows in long clean angles, the smell of old parchment and dust, and something underneath both of those things that was specific to rooms where a great deal of knowing had accumulated over time. Madame Pants was at her desk doing something with a catalogue and looked up when Harry came in with the expression of a woman who had been expecting exactly no one this early and wished to make clear that this view had not changed. Harry told her what he was looking for. She gave him directions with the crisp economy of someone who respected a person who knew what they wanted, and he found the 5th shelf in the potions section and ran his finger along the spines until he found Ragnhild Astisardottir's Compound Magics and Long-Term Potions Administration, a thick, dry-looking volume that had not been checked out in 11 years, according to the card in its pocket. He took it to a table near the window and opened it. He read for an hour and 15 minutes without stopping. By the end of it he understood, in precise technical detail, exactly what had been done to him. Not in the emotional register, that was still settling, still finding its levels, but in the architectural sense. The way each compound had been layered. The way fealty's foundation in infancy created a neurological baseline of deference that made subsequent loyalty potions exponentially more effective. The way the emotional suppression draft hadn't just flattened his feelings but had specifically targeted the biochemical precursors to anger and ambition while leaving fear and gratitude largely intact, which meant he'd been built to feel small and lucky rather than capable and wronged. He read the chapter on blood loyalty curses twice. The second time he made notes in the margins, small precise annotations in his cramped handwriting, duration matches, rooted in core magical signature, release trigger equals specific terminal event. He underlined one sentence 3 times. The purpose of a blood loyalty curse embedded in a child's magical core is not to control behavior but to control magical output at a predetermined moment. It is, in the literature, associated exclusively with sacrifice scenarios. He closed the book. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the cover. Then he took a fresh piece of parchment from his bag and began writing, and what he wrote was not a letter to anyone. It was a list. Specific, numbered, organized by category. At the top he wrote a single heading, "What needs to happen?" He was on item 12 when Hermione appeared. She sat down across from him without being asked and without apology, set her own books down, and looked at what he was writing. "Can I see?" He slid the parchment across. She read it, and her expression moved through several things: absorption, recognition, that specific quality she had of mentally cross-referencing everything against her existing knowledge. Then she picked up his quill and added 2 items at the bottom of the list, wrote a note next to item 7, and slid it back. He looked at her additions. Nodded once. "Good. The one about Sirius," she said. "How are you planning to push that through?" "The ministry will stall." "I know." He pulled the DMLE record from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. "But there's no trial record, which means technically he's an unconvicted detainee. Under Section 31 of the Azkaban Commitment Act, an unconvicted detainee can petition for immediate review if a blood relative or legal ward submits a formal challenge." She was reading the record. "You're his legal ward?" "He's my godfather. My parents were murdered. He was never formally stripped of guardianship rights because that would have required a trial, which didn't happen." He looked at her. "Which means legally, he still has custodial priority over me. Which means I can petition as his ward." She stared at him for a moment. "You worked that out from a Wisengamot statute book at midnight. You recommended it." "I know, but," she stopped. Started again. "Harry, that's a genuinely brilliant legal argument." "It might not work," he said. "The ministry will find ways to complicate it. But it puts it on the record. It makes it formal. It means if they leave him in Azkaban after I've made that argument, they have to explain why." He looked at her steadily. "Right now they get to pretend he doesn't exist. I want to take that option away." Hermione looked at him for a long moment with that expression she'd had at breakfast, the one he still couldn't fully name but which he was beginning to associate with something genuine, something that was deciding to be invested in him not because of who he was historically but because of what he was doing right now. "Right," she said, and opened her books. They worked together for the better part of 2 hours, Harry drafting the formal petition for Sirius's review, Hermione catching the precise wording issues that magical legal documents required and suggesting the exact sections to cite. They worked with a rhythm that was unusual for 2 people who had known each other for approximately 36 hours, the kind of rhythm that comes from 2 minds that happen to fit together at the working edge. At one point Neville arrived, looking slightly less haunted than he had at breakfast, and slid in beside Hermione. He had his own parchment and quill and the expression of someone who had made a small but decisive decision. "I want to write to Pomfrey," he said quietly. About the compound in my diagnostic. How do I ask for a formal record?" Hermione shifted her notes without missing a beat. "You write to Pomfrey directly and request a copy of your diagnostic results under patient rights. They're yours, you're entitled to them regardless of age." She paused. "If your grandmother administered it, there may be a record at the apothecary where it was purchased." Neville looked at his blank parchment. "What if I don't?" He stopped. "What if I'm not as angry about it as I should be?" "Then you're not," Harry said, without looking up from his petition. "There's no right way to feel about it. There's just what you actually feel." Neville was quiet for a moment. Then he started writing. They were at the table when the doors opened at 10:15 and Professor McGonagall came in with the specific pace of someone who had been looking in several places. She found Harry, exhaled slightly, and crossed to the table. "There you are." She looked at the spread of parchment and books and made a visible effort not to comment on it. "Madame Bones has arrived. She's in my office." She looked at Harry directly. "She wants to speak with you. This morning." Harry capped his ink. "Now?" "Yes." He looked at Hermione. Something passed between them, a checking in, a brief wordless negotiation of the kind that usually takes years of friendship to develop. "I'll finish the citation section," she said. "Go." He stood. Looked at McGonagall. "Can she come?" McGonagall's eyebrows moved slightly. "Madame Bones asked to speak with you specifically." "I know. I'm asking if Hermione can come." He kept his voice level. "She's been helping me work through the legal framework. She knows the statutes as well as I do at this point." He paused. "I'm not asking because I'm nervous. I'm asking because two people who understand the situation are better than one." McGonagall studied him for a moment. Something in her expression said that she had fully revised her expectations of this child and was still in the process of revising them further. "I'll ask Madame Bones," she said. "If she agrees, then yes." She agreed. Amelia Bones was not what Harry had expected, though he recognized immediately that his expectation had been shaped by nothing more reliable than a ministry's worth of the same kind of thinking that had shaped everything else about his life, and he set that aside. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with short, iron-gray hair and a monocle and the kind of presence that came not from performance but from the specific weight of a person who had spent decades making consequential decisions and being prepared to stand behind them. She stood when they came in, which Harry noted because most adults didn't bother with that for children. "Mr. Potter," she said. Her voice was measured and direct, without condescension or the specific gentleness that people put on when they wanted to manage you. "Sit down, please. Both of you." Harry sat. Hermione sat beside him. McGonagall took her position behind her own desk with the deliberate quality of someone who was staying in the room and was not going to be asked to leave. Bones looked at Harry for a moment with the professional assessment of someone who could read a situation quickly and wanted to be sure she was reading this one right. "How are you feeling?" "Well," he said. "Cleared." She nodded slowly. "I've reviewed the diagnostic record. I've also reviewed Madame Pomfrey's medical report, which she submitted to the DMLE at 6 this morning." She put her hands flat on the desk. "I want to be very direct with you, because I think you're owed directness more than most. What the diagnostic recorded last night represents, under wizarding law, multiple serious criminal violations. Potion administration to a minor without consent. Magical compulsion of a ward. Unauthorized blood curse implantation." She paused. "And potentially, depending on the nature of the blood curse's intended purpose, conspiracy to cause grievous magical harm." The room was very quiet. "I'm opening a formal inquest," she said. "Today. The record is already filed. The signatories on the diagnostic are already in the archive." She looked at him steadily. "I want to be honest with you about what that means. It's going to be loud. The wizarding world is going to have," she searched for the right word, "strong opinions. Dumbledore is not merely a criminal suspect. He is an institution. A symbol. People are going to resist this with everything they have, not because they're evil but because what he is to them is more comfortable than what he did." "I know," Harry said. She looked at him with slightly more attention. "You know. He's been the most powerful wizard alive for 60 years. He has political relationships at every level. He controls the narrative of the war, including his own role in it." Harry kept his voice even. "I know all of that. I also know that the diagnostic basin signatures are magically unimpeachable, which is why he chose potions and blood magic instead of more visible methods, because they're deniable. Except they're not deniable now because Madame Pomfrey ran the diagnostic and the results are already in the archive. He held Bones's gaze. So he can shape the narrative around what he did, but he can't erase what he did. Those are two different problems, and the second one is the one I'm focused on. Bones was very still. Then she looked at McGonagall and said, "How old is he?" 11, McGonagall said, with a combination of pride and grief that was uniquely hers. Bones turned back to Harry. "The inquest will require your testimony. Formal, recorded, under veritaserum if you consent, though I want to be clear that consent is exactly that, you cannot be compelled." She paused. "I also want to make sure you have appropriate representation. A legal advocate, someone who can, I want to contact the Wisengamot directly," Harry said. "I've drafted a petition for Sirius Black's case review. I understand there are other matters, my financial accounts, my guardianship status, but the Black case is urgent because he's actively in Azkaban and every day is," he stopped. Restarted. "Every day is more time in a place that destroys people, and he's been there 10 years already." Bones looked at the petition Harry slid across the desk. She read it. Her expression didn't change much, but her monocle did a small thing that might have been adjustment and might have been involuntary movement. "You drafted this," she said. "With help," Harry said, glancing at Hermione. Hermione, who had been sitting in composed silence this entire time with her hands folded on her notes, said, "The legal framework is sound. Sections 12, 31, and 44 of the relevant statutes. The argument rests on the absence of trial proceedings, which is documented in the DMLE archive." Bones looked at Hermione as though she was also updating her expectations. "Miss Granger." Hermione Granger. "Miss Granger." "Yes." She looked back at the petition. "This is a strong document." She set it down. "I'll file it today. I cannot promise the timeline, the Wisengamot moves at its own pace, but the absence of trial record is, frankly, indefensible, and I've thought so for years." Harry felt something shift, slightly, behind his sternum. Not relief exactly, more the sensation of something moving from one column to another, from intention to emotion. "There's one more thing," Harry said. Bones waited. "Dumbledore's going to move today. He'll have a counter-narrative by noon." He looked at her directly. "I sent a letter to the Prophet last night putting them on notice. I think I need to follow that up with something more concrete, a statement." "My statement." Before his version becomes the version. Bones studied him. "A public statement from an 11-year-old about Albus Dumbledore is going to generate, I know what it'll generate," Harry said. "I also know that if I wait for the right moment will be manufactured by someone else." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm doing, because I think it's better that you know." The silence held for exactly 3 seconds. Then Amelia Bones did something that Harry had not expected. She smiled. It was brief and professional and slightly reluctant, the smile of a woman who recognized something specific and couldn't quite stop herself from acknowledging it. "Draft your statement," she said. "Send it to my office before you release it. Not for approval, I won't be approving it. Just so I know what's coming." She stood. "Mr. Potter. I want you to understand something." She looked at him with the full weight of those decades of consequential decisions behind her eyes. "What you're doing, what you've already done in the last 18 hours, requires courage of a specific kind. Not the kind that runs toward dark wizards. The kind that runs toward institutions." She paused. "That kind is considerably rarer." Harry stood too. "Thank you, Madame Bones." She left. McGonagall sat in her chair for a moment after the door closed and looked at her desk. "He's going to fight back," Harry said. "He wasn't asking." "Yes," McGonagall said. "What will he do?" She looked up. "He'll start with sympathy. The narrative of necessity, he had to act, the threat was too great, sacrifices were required for the greater good. He'll remind people of the war. Of what Voldemort did. He'll make it about choosing between a degree of what he did to you, and a world where Voldemort won. She said this with controlled anger. He's done it before. He is extremely good at making people feel that questioning him is the same as welcoming darkness. And if I'm asking the questions, then he'll make it about your age. Your trauma. Your inability, as an 11-year-old, to fully understand the complexity of what was necessary. She held his gaze. He'll be kind about it. He's always kind about it. That's the mechanism. So he'll use the fact that I'm a child as a way to dismiss me. He'll try. Harry nodded slowly. Then I need to make sure that by the time he does that, enough things are already in motion that dismissing me doesn't dismiss the actions. Hermione, from her chair, said quietly, "The petition is filed. The diagnostic record is in the Ministry archive. The prophet's been put on notice." She looked at Harry. "And Madame Bones is running the inquest. That's 4 things he can't dismiss." Harry looked at her. 5, when the statement goes out. She nodded. They left McGonagall's office and walked back through the castle together, Harry, Hermione, and a silence between them that was the comfortable kind, the kind built on parallel thinking rather than the absence of words. The castle was alive around them in its usual morning way, portraits arguing, students moving between classes, the smell of something burning from the direction of the second floor that was almost certainly someone's first attempt at a transfiguration assignment. "Can I ask you something?" Hermione said. "Yes." "Why aren't you angrier?" She said it carefully, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. "I mean, I'm angry on your behalf and it didn't even happen to me. 10 years of deliberate suppression and you're just, methodically filing petitions." Harry was quiet for a moment, watching the corridor ahead of them. "I am angry," he said. It's like standing next to a fire and feeling the heat. I'm completely aware of it." He paused. "But if I let it drive right now, it'll drive badly. He wants me emotional, the younger, more reactive version of me he was trying to build. I think." He looked at her. "The best thing I can do is be exactly the opposite of what he designed me to be." She was quiet for a moment. "He designed you to be small and grateful." "Yes." "So you're being specific," he said. "And not grateful at all." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, which startled both of them slightly. They turned the corner and nearly walked directly into Draco Malfoy, who was coming from the other direction with 2 large boys flanking him and the particular expression he wore when he was deciding how to enter a room. He stopped when he saw Harry. The large boys stopped too. There was a moment. Malfoy looked at Harry with an expression that was doing several things at once, the performative challenge he'd been assembling on his face since approximately the first moment Harry had seen him on the Hogwarts Express was there, but it was working against something else, something that had been in his face last night in the Great Hall when his mouth had been very slightly open. He had seen the diagnostic. He had sat in that hall and watched the ribbons rise and heard Pomfrey read the signatures. He knew, as every student at Hogwarts now knew, exactly what those 52 compounds meant. "Potter," he said. "Malfoy," Harry said, in the same register. A beat. Last night was, Malfoy started, and whatever he'd been planning to say met some internal resistance and came out differently than intended. "My father speaks very highly of Dumbledore." "Does he?" Harry said. "He says he's the greatest wizard of the age." Malfoy's voice had the quality of a person testing the load-bearing capacity of a familiar floor and discovering something unexpected. "He says the reason the war ended the way it did was because of Dumbledore's. Your father's opinion is interesting to me," Harry said, "mostly for what it tells me about who Dumbledore has been cultivating. Not because it changes anything." Malfoy blinked. That was clearly not what he prepared for. "I wasn't defending him," he said, slightly sharper. "I know," Harry said. You were feeling out which way things are falling. I understand. He held Malfoy's gaze. They're falling one way. You can work out which one. Another beat. Something moved in Malfoy's expression, quick and young and complicated, the flash of a boy who has been brought up inside a particular set of assumptions and is suddenly aware, possibly for the first time, that the assumptions are a cage. My father will vote against the inquest, Malfoy said carefully. I know, Harry said. There are a lot of people who will. I know that too. Malfoy looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved aside from the corridor and gestured his two flanking companions onward. As Harry walked past, Malfoy said, not quite quietly enough for it to be truly private, the Slytherin library has better books on Wisengamot procedure than the main library. Third alcove on the left. Harry stopped. Looked back over his shoulder. Malfoy was already walking away. Harry watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the corridor. Hermione had witnessed all of this with the expression of someone who is rapidly updating a complex model. Did he just, yes, Harry said. Draco Malfoy just helped you. Don't make too much of it, Harry said. He's hedging. He's deciding which side has better odds. He paused. But the information's still useful. They stopped at the main library long enough to collect Neville, who had finished his letter to Pomfrey and was now working through a book on magical inheritance law with the focused expression of someone who had discovered that knowing things was considerably better than not knowing them. Harry told him about the Slytherin library tip. Neville looked at the table. I'm not going into the Slytherin common room. Neither am I, Harry said. But I know someone who is. He went looking for Snape. He found him in his office, not the potions classroom but the smaller office adjacent to it, which had the character of a room assembled entirely from function. No decoration. Books organized with military precision. A desk with nothing on it that wasn't necessary. Snape was sitting behind it writing something, and when Harry knocked on the open door he looked up with an expression that did not change much but changed in specific ways that Harry was beginning to read. Potter. Professor. Harry came in but didn't sit because he hadn't been invited to. He stood in front of the desk. I need a favor. Snape set down his quill. He looked at Harry with the unreadable precision of a man who had spent 20 years maintaining one expression over whatever was actually happening underneath it. That is an interesting opening from someone who has known me for approximately 18 hours. I know. Harry didn't apologize. Malfoy told me the Slytherin library has better resources on Wisengamot procedure. I'd like access to them. Snape was quiet for a moment. Why did Malfoy tell you that? Because he's uncertain about which way to align himself, and giving me useful information is a hedge that costs him very little. Harry held his gaze. I think he might be worth talking to, eventually. Not as an ally exactly. But as someone whose position is less fixed than it looks. Snape studied him. Malfoy's father has significant Wisengamot presence, Harry continued. His vote against the inquest is useful to Dumbledore. But Lucius Malfoy's primary loyalty is to himself and his family's standing, not to Dumbledore specifically. If the inquest gains enough momentum, Malfoy's positioning will shift to wherever the power is. He paused. I'm not expecting Draco to do anything. I'm just saying I don't think he's my enemy yet. You are 11, Snape said. You keep noticing that, Harry said, without heat. Something moved, briefly, through Snape's expression. The Slytherin library, he said, after a moment, is available to students doing supervised academic research. I can arrange supervised access. He looked at Harry steadily. I will not be doing you favors, Potter. I will be providing access to resources that any student could theoretically request. That is what this is. Of course, Harry said. Additionally, Snape said, in the tone of a man who is about to say something he has organized very carefully, the book I mentioned in my letter. You read it. This morning. And? Harry looked at him. I understood the architecture. I understood what each compound did and what it was designed to do. He paused. I understood the blood curse. The silence that followed was of a particular kind. Snape had gone still in the way Harry had noticed last night, the complete, costly stillness of someone imposing enormous control over a reaction they cannot afford to show. The sacrifice scenario, Harry said quietly. That's what it was built for. Snape said nothing for a long moment. Then, yes. You knew. Harry said it without accusation, simply, as a fact being placed on the table between them. I suspected, Snape said. I did not have evidence. I suspected the design but not the specifics. Not the full, not the scope of it. His jaw moved. I told myself, I had reasons, I'm not angry at you for it, Harry said. And then, because he wanted to be precise and because precision was what he was building himself around right now, not yet. It depends on what you do from here. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his dark eyes, the complicated movement of a man who has been held to account by an 11-year-old and cannot even find the mechanism to resent it, because it's fair. The library access will be arranged by this afternoon, Snape said, picking up his quill again. Harry nodded. Thank you, Professor. He left. In the corridor outside he leaned against the stone wall for a moment and let himself be 11 for a few seconds. Let himself feel the weight of the morning, the meetings, the letters, the legal framework, the careful calculation of every conversation. He pressed the back of his head against the cold stone and breathed. His actual self was considerably more tiring than the suppressed one. The suppressed one had just gone along with things. His actual self had opinions. He pushed off from the wall and went back to find Hermione and Neville. The afternoon passed in the structured chaos of first-day schedules, classes that Harry attended with the slightly surreal quality of someone who has been awake at a very high register all day and is now expected to care about introductory transfiguration. He cared about it, actually, which surprised him. When McGonagall placed a match on each student's desk and told them to turn it into a needle, Harry looked at his match for exactly 3 seconds before it became a needle. Not a rough needle, a perfect needle, silver bright, with a proper eye and a tapered point. McGonagall walked past. Stopped. Looked at the needle. Looked at Harry. Well, she said, and moved on, but her voice had the quality of someone who had decided to store that moment somewhere safe. He changed it back into a match without being asked. Hermione, at the desk beside him, had produced a needle that was mostly right except for a slightly flattened eye. She was frowning at it with the concentrated energy of someone who was going to have a perfect needle by the end of the lesson if the needle knew what was good for it. Neville's match had sprouted what appeared to be tiny leaves. Fascinating, McGonagall said, pausing at his desk. That is not what I asked for, Mr. Longbottom, but it's, quite genuinely fascinating. She made a note on her parchment that did not look like a deduction. After transfiguration came the walk back across the castle for an afternoon that was theoretically free for first years. Harry spent the first part of it in the Slytherin section of the library that Snape had unlocked. It was, as Malfoy had implied, considerably better stocked on Wisengamot procedure, with 2 complete editions of the Wisengamot Statutes Compendium and a legal text called Formal Inquest Procedures under the Magical Law Enforcement Act that was exactly what he needed. He took notes for an hour and a half. Hermione sat across from him and read a different section of the same statute book and occasionally read something aloud that she thought was relevant, which was more often than you might expect and at exactly the level of usefulness you would expect from Hermione. He drafted the public statement at 4 in the afternoon, sitting in the Gryffindor common room with the fire going and the late afternoon light coming through the windows. He drafted it 3 times. The first was too emotional, he could feel the morning's cold anger in it, and anger, deployed publicly, would give Dumbledore the troubled child narrative he was looking for. The second was too detached and read like a legal filing. The third was the right version. It was 6 paragraphs. It stated clearly what the diagnostic had found. It stated his position on the inquest, and his support for it. It stated his concern for Sirius Black's case. It stated that he would be pursuing every available legal avenue regarding his guardianship arrangements and the management of his accounts. And it closed with a single sentence that he wrote and rewrote 4 times before he was satisfied. I have been told, at various points in my life, that the people making decisions for me knew best. I am asking the wizarding world to help me find out whether that is true. He read it back to Hermione. She was quiet for a moment. The last line, she said. Too much. No. It's right. It's the right note. She looked at him. It doesn't sound angry. It sounds like someone asking a fair question. That's what I want, Harry said. Let Dumbledore's answer be what makes people angry. He copied it clean, sealed it, sent an owl copy to Bones's office as promised, and then sent the original to the Daily Prophet. By the time dinner was laid in the Great Hall, Snape had delivered 3 books from the deeper Slytherin library to Harry's dormitory, with a note that said only, reading list. Not a favor. Neville had received a reply from Madame Pomfrey confirming his full diagnostic record and a separate note, written in Pomfrey's hand, that contained 2 words, I know. He had looked at it for a long time. Hermione had located a precedent case from 1932 in which a minor ward had successfully petitioned the Wisingamot for guardianship review, which meant Harry's petition had a legal precedent. Ron had spent most of the day watching Harry from the other end of the Gryffindor table with the expression of someone who wanted very much to be useful and was figuring out how. The twins had spent dinner making the pointed and repeated observation, loudly enough to Carrie, that Dumbledore had not appeared in the Great Hall today. He hadn't. McGonagall had taken the headmaster's seat for both meals, and she'd done it with the air of someone who had not been asked to but had decided to be there anyway. After dinner, Harry went up to the dormitory to write one more letter. This one was the hardest. He sat with his quill for several minutes before he started, because there was no legal framework for this one, no statute to cite, no procedural language to stand behind. He addressed it to Sirius Black. He didn't know if it would get through. Letters to Azkaban were heavily monitored and frequently stopped. But he wrote it anyway, because there was something important about the act of writing it, about saying I know you're there and I know what happened and I'm working on it, and because if it did get through, he wanted Sirius to know, before any formal petition arrived, that someone was coming. He wrote, I don't know you yet. But I know you weren't given the chance to be my godfather, and I think that matters. Hold on. He sealed it. Looked at it for a moment. Then he sent it, and watched the owl carry it out the window into the dark, and listened to the castle settle around him for the night. Somewhere in this building, Albus Dumbledore was in his office building a counter-narrative, running his calculations, deciding which pieces were still in play. Harry picked up Snape's book from the stack and opened it. He had a great deal more to learn before the inquest arrived. He started reading. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The Prophet hit doorsteps across Britain at 6 in the morning. The headline was not subtle. Rita Skeeter, who had been waiting her entire career for something precisely this large to land in her lap, had given it the full front page with a photograph of the diagnostic basin from the night of the sorting. Someone had managed a quick photograph before the hall cleared, which meant either a student with a camera or a staff member with loose loyalties, and either way it was done now. The headline read, 52 Compounds, The Truth About Harry Potter's Protection. Beneath it, in slightly smaller type, Boy Who Lives' own statement, in full, and the name attached to every potion. Harry's 6 paragraphs ran verbatim on page 2. Dumbledore's counter-statement, which had clearly been drafted in the small hours and submitted before dawn, ran on page 4. It was everything McGonagall had predicted, measured, sorrowful, full of the specific language of regretted necessity. The war. The prophecy. The impossible calculus of protecting a child in extraordinary circumstances. I acted out of love for this boy and for this world. It was well written. It was genuinely moving, in the way that things written by very intelligent people with a deep understanding of their audience are moving. It would have worked, probably, if it had run before Harry's statement instead of after it. Because the statement that ran on page 2 was not the statement of a traumatized child. It was the statement of someone asking a fair question in plain language, and the contrast with the measured, sophisticated architecture of Dumbledore's page 4 response was, as Hermione observed at breakfast, reading both with the focused intensity of someone processing evidence, not good for him. He sounds like he's explaining himself to adults, she said, cutting the prophet's pages with a severing charm so she could lay them flat. Your statement sounds like you're asking the world a question. His sounds like he was already answering before anyone asked. He was, Harry said. He was eating, which Pomfrey had been adamant about, and reading over Hermione's shoulder. He drafted it before the paper came out. He was responding to what he knew I'd sent, not to public reaction. He moved too fast. He's used to being the one who moves first, Neville said, from across the table. He had his own copy of the Prophet folded to page 4 and was reading with an expression Harry had come to recognize as his thinking face, careful, unhurried, more precise than people gave him credit for. That's exactly it, Harry said. Being first is his move. Whoever frames the narrative first, he stopped. Controls it, Hermione finished. Right. And last night he was second. He looked at the paper. He won't make that mistake again. The Great Hall had a different quality this morning. The normal breakfast noise was there, but it was layered over something else, the specific hum of 400 people who had all read the same thing over breakfast and were processing it simultaneously. The paper was on every table. People were reading, talking, trading pages. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy had his copy face down and was eating with the deliberate composure of someone very carefully not thinking about what his father's morning had been like. At the staff table, 3 seats were empty. Dumbledore's. Professor Quirrell's, though his absence attracted less attention. And the seat that sometimes belonged to a rotating cast of defense teachers. McGonagall was at the center, which put her at the physical location of the headmaster's chair without her having formally claimed the title. Harry noticed this and suspected she had arranged it precisely. The Owls came at 8:30 and brought, along with the usual Morning Post, a volume of correspondence that Errol, the Weasley family owl, would have described as catastrophic. Harry received 11 letters before the post was done. He stacked them neatly beside his plate and ate the rest of his porridge before opening any of them. Hermione watched this with visible impatience. Aren't you going to, in a moment? He finished his porridge. Drank his juice. Then opened them in order of apparent urgency, which he judged by the seals rather than the names. 3 were from Wisengamot members, 2 expressing concern, 1 expressing very carefully worded support. 1 was from a wizarding family he'd never heard of whose child had apparently been subjected to similar compulsion potions under Dumbledore's recommendation years earlier, which made his jaw tighten briefly before he filed it carefully. 1 was from a journalist at Spellbound magazine requesting an interview. 1 was from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement acknowledging receipt of his Sirius Black petition, which he had been waiting for. 1, at the bottom of the stack, had no seal. Just his name on the envelope in handwriting that was old and very precise and which he had seen before, on his Hogwarts letter. His actual Hogwarts letter, the first one, which he'd found after moving into the dormitory to be subtly different from the others in ways he could now identify as the result of a mild compulsion charm. He opened it. Harry. I would very much like to speak with you. I understand if you prefer not to, and I will not press the matter if that is your decision. But I believe there are things between us that cannot be properly addressed through the intermediary of a formal inquest, and I would ask for the chance to say them directly. If you are willing, I will be in my office at any time you choose today. I remain, as I have always been, yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it twice. Folded it. Put it in his pocket. Dumbledore? Hermione said. She'd seen the handwriting over his shoulder. Yes. Are you going? He was quiet for a moment. Yes. Her expression did a brief, involuntary thing. Harry, I know. He looked at her. I'm not going because I trust him. I'm going because I want to look at him in a room and see what he does. He paused. And because there are things I want to say directly too. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, I'll come with you. No, he said. This one I do alone. She didn't like it. The shape of her mouth made that clear. But she didn't argue, which he appreciated, and instead she picked up her quill and said, then I'm going to the library. There are 2 more precedent cases I haven't finished cross-referencing. Good, he said. Amelia Bones arrived at Hogwarts at 9:45 in the company of 2 junior Aurors, a court recorder, and a woman in Wizengamot robes who turned out to be the chief inquest officer for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Formal Investigation Division. Harry met them in the entrance hall along with McGonagall, and they moved together up to the formal meeting room on the 2nd floor, one of the castle's official spaces, high-ceilinged and rarely used, with the quality of a room that had been designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. The court recorder set up her basin and quill. The Aurors stood at the sides. Bones took her seat and unrolled a very long piece of parchment and looked at Harry across the table. Today is preliminary testimony, she said. Not formal inquest, that will convene at the Wizengamot in 10 days. What I need from you today is a witness account of your experience, your understanding of the diagnostic results, and a formal statement of your wishes regarding guardianship and further investigation. Is that clear? Yes. You may have an adult representative present. Professor McGonagall has offered. I want Madame Pomfrey, Harry said. McGonagall, who was standing to the side, did not react visibly. But she moved immediately to the door and sent a student to fetch Pomfrey. She was there in 4 minutes, in her white Medowitch robes, with a calm expression and her diagnostic kit in her hand. She sat beside Harry without being asked twice. Bones began. The testimony took 2 hours. Harry answered everything directly, without hesitation and without embellishment. He described what he remembered of his childhood, the things he could now access that the memory modification compounds had been blurring for years, coming up in fragments and pieces, still not fully clear but clear enough. The cupboard. The first day of primary school, when he'd accidentally turned his teacher's desk a bright, vivid orange and had been sent home with a letter that Aunt Petunia had burned, and which he now remembered had made something flicker briefly in her expression before she'd smoothed it over. The way he'd always felt slightly less than himself, slightly truncated, as though the full version of him was somewhere just out of reach. He described the diagnostic. He described his analysis of the compounds from Astisardotter's book. He described the blood curse with the specific, technical language of someone who had read carefully and understood what they'd read, and the court recorder's quill kept pace without pausing and Bones's expression was steady and focused and the chief inquest officer, who had not said a word, was writing her own notes with increasing speed. When Harry said sacrifice scenario, the room was very quiet. You believe, Bones said carefully, based on your analysis of the blood loyalty curse's documented purpose, that the curse was designed to release your full magical capability at the moment of your death in a final confrontation with Voldemort. Yes. And that this release was intended to function as the mechanism for Voldemort's defeat. That's how it reads in the literature, Harry said. A terminal magical event. The curse holds back your full power until it breaks, and it breaks at death. If that death occurs at the right moment, in the right circumstances, the released power destroys whatever it's aimed at. He paused. It's a very elegant design, actually. From a purely architectural standpoint. You build a weapon that doesn't know it's a weapon, that willingly walks into the terminal situation because it's been made compliant and self-sacrificing, and at the moment of death it does what you built it to do. The silence in the room was heavy and specific. He built me to die, Harry said. It was the first time he'd said it that plainly, out loud, and he registered the fact of saying it the way you register setting down something heavy. And he built me to be okay with it. He looked at Bones steadily. That's what the loyalty compounds were for, ultimately. Not just to trust him. To trust that whatever happened was right and necessary. To accept. He paused. I think if the diagnostic hadn't happened, if I'd gone through Hogwarts as designed, I would have. I would have walked into it willingly. I would have thought it was the right thing. He let that sit for a moment. That's the part that I keep, that's the part that requires the most. He stopped. Pomfrey put her hand briefly on his arm. He took a breath. That's what I'd like the inquest to establish clearly, he said, returning to the even register. Not just that he administered potions without consent. But the purpose. The designed purpose of the whole architecture. Bones looked at him for a long moment. We will establish it, she said. I want you to know, this testimony is being recorded under the highest seal of magical authentication. It cannot be altered or disputed as a document. She paused. And I want to be honest with you again, as I was yesterday. What you've described, if corroborated by the magical forensic analysis of the blood curse, and I have the Ministry's curse-breaking division running that analysis right now, constitutes conspiracy to commit magical murder under wizarding law. I know, Harry said. That is an extraordinary charge against an extraordinary individual. The political fallout will be, I know, Harry said again. I don't care. Bones looked at him. You don't care. About the political fallout? No. He held her gaze. I care about what's true and what's right. The politics are someone else's problem. Mine is making sure the record is clear. He paused. And making sure it can't be buried. When the testimony ended and the court recorder sealed her basin and the junior aurors packed their equipment, Bones walked with Harry to the door and said, very quietly, the Wisengamot convenes in 10 days. Your petition for Black's case review has been fast-tracked, that hearing will happen within the week, separate from the main inquest. She paused. I thought you'd want to know. Thank you, Harry said. Don't thank me yet. The inquest is going to be an extraordinary fight. She looked at him with that monocle catching the light. Be ready. He was already walking. He went to Dumbledore's office at 2 in the afternoon. He climbed the spiral staircase behind the gargoyle, which moved aside for him without being given a password, which told him something, and knocked twice on the heavy oak door. Come in, Harry. The office was everything it had always been described as being. The portraits of former headmasters lined the walls. The silver instruments ticked and spun on their shelves. Fawkes was on his perch, and when Harry came in the Phoenix looked at him with those ancient, steady eyes and made a sound that was not quite singing, something lower, quieter, more like acknowledgement. Dumbledore was behind his desk. He looked exactly as he always had, the long silver beard, the half-moon glasses, the robes that managed to be both elaborate and somehow comfortable. He looked, in fact, precisely the same as he had in the Great Hall 2 nights ago, which was itself a kind of information. He looked genuinely glad to see Harry, and that specifically, was the thing Harry had come to see. Sit down, Dumbledore said, gesturing to the chair across the desk with the warm, easy hospitality of a man receiving a valued guest. Can I offer you something? Tea, perhaps. No thank you, Harry said. He sat. He looked at the man across the desk and thought, there it is. The warmth was real. That was the impossible part, the warmth was not performed. Albus Dumbledore genuinely cared about Harry Potter. He had administered 52 compounds over 10 years and built a blood curse into his magical core and designed his death from the ground up, and he had done all of it with genuine care. That was, Harry thought, possibly the most dangerous thing in the room. I imagine you've had a very full 2 days, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. I gave testimony to Madame Bones this morning. I know. No flinch. No change in the warmth. I suspected you would. You've moved very quickly, Harry, and I want you to know that I respect that. The clarity of mind you've shown, it's remarkable. Truly remarkable. You're being complimentary, Harry said, to establish rapport. I'd rather you just said what you wanted to say. A pause. Something shifted, very slightly, in Dumbledore's expression, not defensiveness, but something like recalibration. He was reclassifying who he was talking to, Harry thought. Adjusting the approach. "You're right," Dumbledore said, and folded his hands on the desk. "Harry. I want you to understand why I made the choices I made. Not to defend them, I think you have already moved past the point where my defense would have any particular weight, and I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. But to explain them, honestly, so that you can judge them with full information." "All right," Harry said. "Explain." So Dumbledore did. He told Harry about the prophecy. The full prophecy, not the partial version that had circulated, neither can live while the other survives, but the full text, spoken to him by Sybil Trelawney in a pub in Hogsmeade 16 years ago. He told it with the precision of a man who had carried it for 16 years and knew every word by heart. He told it plainly. Harry listened. He'd suspected most of it. The sacrifice scenario made the prophecy's logic clear. But hearing it stated fully, in that warm voice, in this room full of ticking instruments, it landed differently than reading about blood curses in a clinical text. It had weight. The compounds, Dumbledore continued, were never intended as control, Harry. I want to be very clear about that. They were designed, specifically and carefully, to protect you. The loyalty potions ensured you would trust the people who needed to guide you. The suppression draft protected you from the kind of dangerous emotional volatility that kills young wizards who don't know their own power. The blood curse, he paused here, for just a moment, and in that pause there was something that was the closest he'd come to showing a crack. The blood curse was the most difficult decision. I won't pretend otherwise. But the prophecy is not negotiable, Harry. Voldemort will return. The killing curse he cast left part of his soul in you. The only way to destroy it without killing you immediately is a terminal magical release, Harry said. From a blood loyalty curse designed to maximize your power output at the moment of death. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I read the book. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. You did. I want to understand something, Harry said. Not the logic. I understand the logic. The prophecy requires a death, yours or mine or Voldemort's, in some configuration. You decided the most efficient path was building me into a willing sacrifice who releases maximum power on death. He paused. I understand the logic. What I want to understand is, did you consider the alternative? Dumbledore looked at him. What alternative? That I might be capable of dealing with Voldemort without dying, Harry said. That you might tell me the prophecy, tell me the truth, let me develop my actual magical ability, which you were suppressing with the blood curse, by the way, and let me make an informed choice. He held the old man's gaze. Did you ever consider that? A long pause. I considered it, Dumbledore said. And I decided that the risk, that you would know the weight of what was coming and it would break you, or that in the fullness of your power you would find a path that led to greater casualties, I decided the risk was too great. You decided, Harry said. Not me. You decided, for me, before I could decide for myself. You were a child. I was an infant, Harry said. And then a toddler. And then a child. And then I was 8, and 9, and 10, and 11, and at each of those ages you kept deciding for me, and each year I was closer to being old enough to decide and you just, he stopped. Breathed. You kept deciding. Dumbledore was quiet. Here's what I think, Harry said, and his voice was steady and clear and absolutely without heat, which was somehow more present in the room than shouting would have been. I think you are genuinely convinced you were right. I think you looked at the prophecy and at Voldemort and at the war and at an infant in a crib and you made what felt to you like the hardest, most loving decision available. I think you believed it. He paused. And I think that the capacity to cause this much damage while fully believing you're doing good is not a defense. It is the specific thing that makes you dangerous. The ticking of the instruments was very loud in the silence. The inquest is going to establish what was done to me, Harry continued. The magical forensic analysis of the blood curse is running now. The diagnostic record is in the archive. My testimony is sealed and authenticated. He stood up. I'm not asking you to admit anything in this room. You'll have the inquest for that. I came here because I wanted to say this to your face. He looked at Dumbledore directly. You built me to be a weapon and a sacrifice and a lesson, and you were very kind about it. And none of that, none of the care or the warmth or the genuine love, whatever version of that you're capable of, none of it makes what you did to me acceptable. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that was, finally, not entirely composed. There was something in it that was older and sadder than the warmth, something that sat underneath the grandfatherly serenity and had been sitting there, Harry suspected, for a very long time. I know, Dumbledore said, very quietly. I know it doesn't. It was, Harry thought, the most honest thing he'd said. He walked to the door. Stopped with his hand on the frame. You should have a solicitor at the inquest, he said. And you should know, I'm not doing this to destroy you. I'm doing it because the record has to be true. He paused. There's a difference. He left. He walked down the spiral staircase and through the corridor and did not stop until he reached an alcove off the 4th floor that he'd found yesterday, a small windowed recess that looked out over the grounds toward the lake. He sat in the window and looked at the water. He stayed there for 10 minutes. Then he stood up, took 3 deep breaths, and went to find Hermione. She was in the library, as expected, but she had company he hadn't anticipated. Neville was there, which was expected. But seated across from them was Percy Weasley, who had a stack of legal texts and the expression of someone who had made a decision about where they stood and was demonstrating it through bibliography. And beside Percy, which was a surprise, was Flitwick. The tiny charms professor had a cup of tea and 3 books and had apparently been there for some time. He looked up when Harry came in and said, very calmly, Mr. Potter. Good. Sit down. We have an interesting problem. Harry sat. The inquest convenes in 10 days, Flitwick said, rearranging his books with small, precise movements. The formal charge will rest on the diagnostic record and the forensic analysis of the blood curse. But Albus's defense will be the prophecy, specifically, that the prophecy constituted a mitigating circumstance that made his actions a form of legitimate guardianship. Can a prophecy actually do that? Harry asked. Legally. That, Flitwick said, is the interesting problem. The answer is, complicated. There is precedent in 1891 for prophecy-based mitigation in the Wisengamot, but the circumstances were different. What I've been trying to establish is whether a prophecy can constitute legal justification for actions that would otherwise constitute criminal harm to a minor. And? Harry looked at him. My preliminary reading suggests no, Flitwick said. But the argument will be made, and it will be made persuasively, and we need to be ready for it. He looked at Harry with his bright, sharp eyes. The strongest counter-argument is the alternative you raised with Madame Bones this morning, he caught Harry's expression. Yes, I know about the testimony. Bones and I spoke this afternoon. The counter-argument is that even accepting the prophecy's existence and its requirements, the chosen method was not the only method. That a fully informed, fully capable Harry Potter might have been able to fulfill the prophecy's terms without a manufactured death. He paused. Which requires us to establish that the blood curse and the suppression compounds actively reduced your magical capability. They did, Pomfrey said from the doorway, and everyone looked at her. She came in with her diagnostic kit and sat down with the air of someone who had also decided where she stood. I've run additional scans. The blood curse was suppressing approximately 60% of Mr. Potter's natural magical output. She looked at Harry. Which is, I need you to understand what that means in context. Your natural output, unimpeded, at age 11, is already in the upper 2 percentile of recorded magical capability in the British wizarding population. The table was very quiet. You mean, Neville started. I mean that what Harry has been able to do for the past 2 days, the clarity of thought, the strategic reasoning, the precision of his actions, he has been doing at 40% of his natural capacity, Pomfrey said. As the blood curse continues to dissolve over the next week, you will see the rest. She looked at Harry carefully. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. There may be some instability while your magic recalibrates to its full range. Define instability, Harry said. Accidental magic. Unusual manifestations. Nothing dangerous, your control is exceptional, but things may express themselves when you're emotional. Right. He thought about this. How long until the full recalibration? A week. Perhaps 10 days. He looked at Flitwick. Which is exactly when the inquest begins. Flitwick smiled, and it was the precise, sharp smile of a very intelligent person recognizing a situation. Yes. Which means that by the time you walk into the Wizengamot, you will be fully yourself for the first time in your life. He paused. That is either convenient or poetic. Possibly both. We need one more thing, Hermione said. She had been listening to all of this with characteristic intensity and had been writing while Pomfrey spoke and had 3 pages of notes already. She looked around the table. We need the 2 unidentified signatures from the diagnostic. The ones that aren't Dumbledore and aren't Petunia Dursley. Pomfrey's working on it, Harry said. I've sent the residue samples to the Ministry's Magical Forensics Division, Pomfrey confirmed. I expect results within 48 hours. Good, Hermione said. Because if either of those signatures connects to someone currently in a position of influence, a Wizengamot member, a Ministry official, the inquest's scope changes significantly. You think it might? Neville asked. I think 52 compounds over 10 years is not a one-person operation, Hermione said flatly. Dumbledore is brilliant, but he's also headmaster, chief warlock, and supreme mugwump. He has a great many things to manage. Some of this required logistics, access to the Dursley house, procurement of compounds that are controlled substances, regular administration for a decade. She looked at Harry. Someone helped. Maybe more than one someone. Harry had thought about this. He'd thought about it since the morning he'd read Astis Ardotter's book, and the logistics had been nagging at him since. The Dursley signature is procurement, he said slowly. She was the one administering, at least for the first few years, the formula drops. But she wouldn't know what she was buying or from whom. She'd need a contact. Someone she trusted, Neville said, thinking through it. Someone who gave her a reason. Dumbledore told her they were protective, Harry said. He visited the Dursleys when he placed me with them. She hates magic, she'd have complied if she was told it was magic suppressing. Told that keeping me suppressed magically was keeping me safe. He paused. Keeping her safe. So she was being used as well, Hermione said, and the observation landed with a weight that was partly legal and partly something more human. Harry looked at the table for a moment. He thought about Petunia Dursley. He thought about a woman who had spent her adult life defined by her hatred of magic and her terror of it and her determination to be ordinary, and he thought about what it would mean to be told by Albus Dumbledore himself that you needed to dose your nephew's formula every morning to keep the danger at bay. He thought about whether she'd known what she was doing. He thought she probably hadn't. He was not, precisely, ready to feel sorry for her. But he filed used alongside her name in the running document of his mind and moved forward. The evening brought new complications. At 7 o'clock, a ministry owl arrived for McGonagall with a formal notification that the Hogwarts Board of Governors had called an emergency session for the following morning to discuss the ongoing situation regarding the school's headmaster. The owl also carried a note from 3 Wizengamot members requesting that Dumbledore be formally suspended from his role as chief warlock pending the inquest. At 7:30, Snape appeared at the library door and told Harry, without preamble, that Dumbledore had requested the full staff attend a meeting tonight and that Harry should be aware of what was likely to be said. He's going to ask the staff to support him, Harry said. He's going to ask the staff to trust him, Snape said, with the specific emphasis of someone making a distinction. There is a difference. Trust is a request. Support is leverage. He paused. I am telling you this because you should know that the staff's response will be mixed. There are people on that staff who will support him because they believe he is right. There are people who will support him because they are afraid of what the alternative looks like. He looked at Harry directly. And there is at least one person on that staff who will not. You, Harry said. I have made my position clear to Professor McGonagall, Snape said. That is as far as I will characterize it. He turned to go. Stopped. Said, without turning back, the forensic report on the blood curse. The curse-breaking division's analysis. He reached into his robe and withdrew a folded parchment and placed it on the table. I have a contact there. They sent a preliminary tonight. He left. Harry looked at the parchment. He opened it. He read it once. Looked up at Hermione. Slid it across. She read it. Her face went very still, and then, in the way of someone who has confirmed a terrible suspicion, it settled into a hard, clear expression. She looked up. This confirms the sacrifice design, she said. Yes. And it establishes that the curse was not a protection curse that happened to function this way. It was designed, from inception, specifically for this purpose. She set it down. This is the document that changes why he did it from misguided protection to deliberate construction. This is what shifts it from a tragic mistake to what it actually was, Harry said. The table was quiet. Neville, very carefully, said, Harry. Harry looked at him. Are you, he stopped. Not are you okay? I know that's not the right question. He looked at the parchment and back at Harry. Are you, standing up? Harry thought about it. Really considered it, the way he'd been doing with everything, turning it over, checking the actual answer rather than the automatic one. He took stock of himself, sitting in the Hogwarts library at 7:30 in the evening with the forensic confirmation of his own engineered death on the table in front of him, surrounded by people who had chosen to be here, with an inquest 10 days away and a recalibrating magic growing in his chest that occasionally made the candles nearest him flicker. Yes, he said. And it was true. Yeah. I'm standing up. Neville nodded. Once. Like a verdict. Then, Percy said, from his corner, straightening his notes with precise, determined movements, I think we should go over the inquest preparation strategy from the beginning. He looked at Harry over his parchment. I've identified 4 procedural objections that Dumbledore's solicitor is likely to raise and I want us to have responses for each of them before Thursday. Harry looked at Percy Weasley, who had spent 2 days reorganizing his entire understanding of the institution he'd built his identity around and had responded by getting better at being useful rather than crumbling, and felt something that was warm and specific and had the texture of gratitude that was not pharmaceutical. Right, Harry said, and picked up his quill. Let's go through them. They worked until the library closed. Chapter 5, The Undoing. 3 days before the inquest, Dumbledore made his move. Harry found out about it the way he'd found out about most things this week, through Snape, who appeared at the Gryffindor table during breakfast with the air of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation, said, board meeting went differently than expected, in a low voice, set a folded parchment beside Harry's plate, and left without stopping. Harry read it while eating toast. The Board of Governors had convened their emergency session yesterday morning. Lucius Malfoy had attended, along with 6 other governors, and what had been expected to be a suspension hearing had turned, through Dumbledore's presence and 40 minutes of extraordinary rhetoric, into something else entirely. The vote on suspension had failed 4-3. The board had instead issued a statement expressing confidence in Dumbledore's leadership and calling for the ministry to contextualize its inquest within the framework of wartime necessity. Hermione read over his shoulder. He flipped the board. He had 3 days to work on them, Harry said. And Malfoy has 2 votes through proxy arrangements. He folded the parchment. It doesn't change the inquest. The board doesn't have authority over the Wisengamot. No, she agreed. But it changes the optics. Now it looks like an institution stood behind him. One institution, Neville said. He was getting better at this, at the quick, precise parsing of what things meant versus what they looked like. Out of several. Right. Harry looked at the parchment. What it actually does is embolden the Wisengamot members who were already inclined to support him. Gives them cover. He thought for a moment. Draco's father was there. Yes. Harry looked down the Gryffindor table, then across to the Slytherin table. Draco was eating with his usual deliberate composure, but something in his posture was slightly different from usual, a tightness around the shoulders that was doing a poor job of being invisible to anyone who'd been watching him carefully for a week, which Harry had. He didn't know his father was going to do that, Harry said. Hermione looked at Draco, then back at Harry. You're certain? He went to the board meeting expecting a different outcome. He'd told me the board would vote for suspension. Harry kept his voice neutral. Dumbledore got to Lucius Malfoy overnight and Draco didn't know until he read this morning's paper. He paused. Which means there's a gap between what Draco wants to do and what his father is doing. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Are you thinking about talking to him? I'm thinking about it, Harry said. Not yet. But I want to know where that gap is before the inquest. The second thing that happened that morning was more immediately complicated. A ministry owl arrived at 8:30 carrying a formal notice from the Office of Wizarding Family Affairs, which was the ministry department responsible for guardianship arrangements, magical minor welfare, and the placement of orphaned wizarding children. The notice was addressed to Harry and informed him, in the precisely bloodless language of ministry correspondence, that pending the conclusion of the inquest, his current guardianship arrangement, under Dumbledore's established parameters, remained in effect, and that no changes to said arrangement could be legally enacted until the Wisengamot had rendered a finding. Which meant, concretely, that Dumbledore was still his legal guardian. Harry read the notice twice. Then he put it in his pocket with the flat, specific calm of someone who has encountered a wall and is already looking for the door. Can he do anything through that? Neville asked. He'd been reading over Harry's shoulder, which Harry had simply started accepting as a fact of life. Legally, the guardian status means he could theoretically direct my living arrangements, my medical decisions, and my educational path, Harry said. But. He looked up. The inquest has suspended most of that. Active criminal investigation of a guardian triggers automatic limitation of their authority under the Wizarding Minor Protections Act, Section 19. He can't actually act on the guardianship while the inquest is live. You know that from memory, Hermione said. Not an accusation. A recognition. I read it at 2 a.m. on Tuesday, he said. Right. She was looking at him with that expression again, the one that was warm and slightly unsteady, like she was still adjusting to the fact of him. The limitation clause. Yes. He can hold the title but he can't exercise the authority. So it's symbolic, Neville said. It's not nothing, Harry said. Symbols have weight. Dumbledore knows the inquest will look at the guardianship arrangement, and by having the ministry confirm it's still active, he's framing himself as the responsible party, the careful guardian dealing with an unprecedented situation, rather than the criminal subject of investigation. He paused. It's narrative, not legal. But narrative is what he's best at. Hermione looked at him steadily. You need to respond to it. Yes. How? Harry thought for a moment. Outside, the September sky had turned heavy and overcast, the lake surface dark and ruffled under the wind. I need to formally petition for emancipation, he said. Section 47, the Wizarding Minor Protections Act. If I can demonstrate that my established guardianship was used to cause magical harm, I can petition to be declared a magical minor of independent status. It doesn't require the inquest to conclude first, it runs parallel. It requires a Wisengamot member to sponsor the petition, Hermione said. She'd already looked this up. She'd looked up most things before Harry thought to ask for them, which was something he was beginning to rely on in the specific way you rely on a talent that happens to fit perfectly with your own. Flitwick, Harry said. Hermione smiled, a small, sharp smile. I was going to say Bones, but Flitwick is better. He's a Wisengamot member and he's already involved. And he'll do it today if we ask this morning, Harry said, and stood. They found Flitwick in his classroom arranging chairs for a second-year class that didn't start for another hour. He read the petition request that Harry handed him. Harry had drafted it before breakfast, in the 20 minutes between waking up and coming down, and looked up over his half-moon spectacles with his sharp little face arranging itself into something that was satisfaction and something that was also the look of a man who had been waiting 30 years to be this useful. I'll file it this afternoon, Flitwick said. I'll also have a word with Griselda Marchbanks. She's a senior Wisengamot member and she has no love for Albus since the 1970s business. 2 sponsors strengthens the petition significantly. He looked at Harry over his spectacles. You should know that an emancipation petition, if granted, does more than remove Dumbledore's guardianship. It grants you full legal personhood under wizarding law. You can represent yourself in the inquest. You can make binding legal decisions. You can control your accounts. He paused. And you become immune to guardianship-based authority from any adult. Harry looked at him. Good, he said. That's exactly what I want. Flitwick nodded. There was something in the nod that was not just professional, something that was, in its quiet way, admiration. Not the kind that made itself large and demonstrative. The kind that recognizes specific qualities without needing to announce them. The third development came in the afternoon, and it was the one Harry had not planned for. He was in the library again, which had become something between a headquarters and a home in the last week, working through the final preparation materials with Hermione when a first-year Hufflepuff he didn't know came in and said a woman was asking for him in the entrance hall. The woman, described in the Hufflepuff's slightly starstruck account, was very tall, had very red hair and the sort of expression that made you want to stop whatever you were doing. Harry looked at Hermione. I don't know who that is, she said, which was unusual enough that they both went. The woman in the entrance hall was tall and red-haired and somewhere in her mid-30s, and she had the kind of face that had been through things, not visibly, not in any dramatic way, but in the way that experiences leave traces of themselves in the lines around eyes and the set of a mouth. She wore wizarding robes in a deep green that were neither formal nor casual, exactly, and she was standing with the specific quality of someone who is comfortable in their own space regardless of what space that happens to be. She looked at Harry when he came down the stairs and said, "You're him." Not a question. Something else, recognition of a specific kind, like seeing something she'd been told about and finding it accurate. Yes, Harry said. Who are you? My name is Augusta Longbottom, she said. Beside Harry, Neville, who had followed them from the library, made a small involuntary sound. Harry looked at the woman and then at Neville and back at the woman and recalibrated his understanding of the situation very quickly. Augusta Longbottom. Neville's grandmother. The woman who had been putting diminishment compound in her grandson's pumpkin juice every morning, who had told him it was for his protection, who had made him small on purpose. He braced for a difficult conversation. But Augusta Longbottom was looking at her grandson with an expression that Harry had not expected, and it took him a moment to read it because it was the expression of someone who has done a thing and has had several days to sit with having done it, and what they have arrived at is not justification. Neville, she said. Neville was standing very still. I read the paper, Augusta said. Every morning since Tuesday. She paused. I have also spoken at length with a healer at St. Mungo's who is something of an expert in long-term potions' effects on children. Another pause. She was not gentle in her assessment. Gran, Neville started. Let me finish. Her voice had authority in it, the deep, unadorned kind, but something had changed in its direction. It wasn't aimed at Neville as a correction anymore. It was aimed at herself. I told myself the compound was protection. I told myself a boy who didn't know his own strength was a boy who couldn't be hurt by it. I told myself, she stopped. I told myself a great many things that were more comfortable than the truth, which is that I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you the way we lost. She stopped again. Her jaw moved. The way we lost your parents. The entrance hall was very still. I made you smaller, she said, and her voice was controlled and precise and had grief in every syllable of it. I made you smaller because I thought small things were safer. And I was wrong. She looked at her grandson directly. I was wrong, Neville. I'm sorry. Neville looked at his grandmother for a long moment. Something was happening in his face, the slow, tectonic movement of a person revising a fundamental understanding. He was, Harry thought, doing what he himself had done over the last several days, not accepting the apology automatically and reflexively, but actually feeling it, actually turning it over and deciding what it meant. It stopped. Neville said. The compound? I disposed of it Monday morning, Augusta said. Every last dose. Neville nodded slowly. Then, he swallowed. Okay. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't erasure. But it was the beginning of something, the careful first step of a very long conversation. Okay, Gran. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she perhaps hadn't been doing, in the way that people stop seeing the person in front of them when they're busy managing their fear of losing them. Then she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, and whatever that touch carried, it carried it precisely. She turned to Harry. Mr. Potter. Mrs. Longbottom, Harry said. You did this, she said. Not an accusation. Not the inquest specifically. But your actions this week shook something loose in a number of people who had been living comfortably inside certain assumptions. She looked at him with those eyes that had been through things. I am not here to thank you for disrupting my life. I am here because I have contacts on the Wisengamot that may be useful to your case and I am disposed to use them. Harry looked at her for a moment. Then, which members? The corner of her mouth moved, barely, but it moved. Tiberius Ogden, 4-1. And Marcus Belby. Both on the inquest panel. Both, persuadable, with the right pressure applied through the right channels. She paused. I was Madame Longbottom before I was anyone's grandmother, Mr. Potter. I have been navigating the Wisengamot for 40 years. I know, Harry said. Will you sit in on our preparation session this evening? She looked faintly surprised. Then she said, yes, in the way of someone who has come prepared to negotiate and found that the negotiation went faster than expected. Good, Harry said. Dinner first. 7 o'clock, library. He went back to work. The fourth development, and the most personal, arrived that evening. Harry was alone in the Gryffindor common room for the first time all week. Hermione and Neville had gone to dinner, Flitwick had sent a confirmation owl about the emancipation petition, Augusta Longbottom had proved to be an extraordinary tactical mind over 3 hours of inquest preparation, and Percy had gone to bed with a stack of notes and the satisfied expression of someone doing their best possible work. The fire was going, and the common room was warm and quiet, and Harry sat in the armchair by the grate and let himself be still for a moment. His magic had been doing things. Pomfrey had warned him about it, and she hadn't been wrong, the recalibration was visible now, increasingly so. Tuesday it had been the candles. Wednesday, every glass of water within 3 feet of him had developed a persistent surface shimmer, like something was vibrating underneath the liquid. This morning, when he'd read the Board of Governors' notice at breakfast, the marmalade jar had cracked cleanly in half. Not explosively. Cleanly, as though something had simply decided the container was insufficient. He sat in the armchair and felt his magic moving through him like water finding its level after a long constraint, and it was not frightening, it was more like remembering something in your body that you'd been told didn't exist, proprioception returning to a limb that had been asleep. The portrait hole opened. Ron Weasley came through it alone, which was unusual because Ron generally moved in company, with the twins, or with the loose cluster of first-year Gryffindor boys he'd been gravitating toward. He saw Harry and stopped. "Oh," he said. "I thought you'd be in the library." "I was," Harry said. "I'm taking an hour." Ron hesitated in the way of someone who has been wanting to say something all week and has not found the moment. The hesitation was so pronounced it was almost physical. "Sit down," Harry said. Ron sat in the other chair. He was quiet for a moment, turning his wand over in his hands in that particular nervous habit of his. He opened his mouth twice before words came out. "I want to be useful," he said. "To what you're doing. I know Hermione's been helping with the legal stuff and Neville's, and Percy's, but I'm not, I don't know statutes and I'm not," he stopped. "I want to help and I don't know how." Harry looked at him. Really looked, at the earnest, slightly desperate quality of it, at the specific frustration of a person who wants to contribute and can't find the lever. He thought about what Ron Weasley was, beyond the easy surface read. "You know the wizarding world," Harry said. "Like, you grew up in it. You know how things work. Not legally. Culturally." He paused. "Do you know how people are talking about the inquest? Not the newspapers. People. Families." Ron blinked. "Yeah," he said, slightly cautiously. "Mum sent a letter. He stopped. She's conflicted. She trusts Dumbledore. She's always trusted him. Dad's more straightforward about it. He thinks what the diagnostic showed is, well, he thinks it's clearly wrong, what was done, but Mum is having a hard time putting it together with who she thinks Dumbledore is." "That's most people," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron said. "The Pruitts, that's Mum's family, they're divided. And the Bones family obviously, Amelia Bones is Susan's aunt and Susan told me," he stopped. "Susan Bones. Hufflepuff, she sorted first night. She told me her aunt's been wanting to bring something like this for years but didn't have the grounds." He looked at Harry with his blue eyes completely direct. "People are scared," he said. "Not of you. Of what it means if Dumbledore really did, if the person who beat Voldemort was doing the same kind of thing," Harry said. "Yeah." Ron's voice was quiet. "Because if that's true, then it changes everything. About the war. About why we won. About whether," he shook his head. "It's like the foundation of the house." "Tell me about the families," Harry said. "Not the Wisengamot members, I have people working on that. Tell me about the ordinary families. The ones who aren't politically connected. Tell me what they're feeling." Ron looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, the realization that this was the contribution, that this specific knowledge was worth exactly what Harry was implying it was worth. He sat forward. "Mum talks to a lot of people," he said. She doesn't always think of it as information, but it is. She talks to the mothers, mostly. The ones who send their kids here. And what I'm hearing through her letters is," he thought about it carefully, in the way Harry was beginning to recognize as Ron's real thinking pace, slower than it looked, more thorough than people credited. "They believe the diagnostic. Nobody's questioning that. What they're struggling with is whether it matters that he believed he was doing right." "The intent defense," Harry said. "Yeah. And there's also," Ron hesitated. "There's also a bit of but Voldemort, you know. Like, whatever Dumbledore did, he stopped Voldemort, and there are families who remember what that was like and they're not ready to look at the man who ended it and call him," he stopped. "A criminal," Harry said. "Yeah." Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "What would help them," he said. "Not legally. What would help those families with what they're feeling?" Ron thought about it. Genuinely turned it over, which Harry appreciated. He didn't reach for the easy answer. "Honestly?" Ron said. I think most of them want to know that it's possible to say he did something wrong without saying the war was lost. Like, the war was won, the cost was real, but the method of winning was also wrong, and both of those things can be true at the same time. He paused. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense, Harry said. And you're right, that's what I need to say at the inquest. Ron looked at him, and the look had something new in it, not the starstruck quality from the first night, not the anxious wanting to help from 5 minutes ago. Something steadier. You're going to be speaking at the inquest yourself? Yes. Not just testimony. Like, directly to the Waisengemot? If the emancipation petition goes through in the next 2 days, I can represent myself formally. He looked at Ron. I'll have help, Bones, Flitwick, Mrs. Longbottom. But I want to speak myself. In my own words. Ron nodded slowly. What you just said. What I said. About the war being won and the method being wrong. He paused. That's your central argument, isn't it? Harry looked at him. How did you? Because it's the only thing that addresses everyone at once, Ron said. The people who'll support Dumbledore because of the war, the people who think what he did was wrong, the people who are just lost about it. If you can say both things are true, then nobody has to choose between Voldemort and the truth. He stopped. Looked slightly alarmed at himself. Sorry. I'm not trying to, I don't know law, I was just, don't apologize for that, Harry said. And he meant it with the full weight of a person who has spent the week surrounded by people who were very good at specific things and had just had someone demonstrate a different, equally crucial skill. That's exactly right. That's the framing. Ron looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the fire, and then said, with the casualness of someone being very deliberately casual, Fred and George want to help too. They're not going to say it to your face because they think it sounds too earnest, but they're furious, actually. About what was done to you. Fred hasn't made a single joke about it since Tuesday, and Fred always makes jokes about things. Harry thought about this. What do they want to do? They know people, Ron said. Older students, mostly. 7th years, 6th years. People whose families were in the war. I think they've been quietly talking to people. Taking a temperature. He paused. You've got more support in this school than you know. Harry looked at the fire for a moment. It was a strange thing, to have support, to feel it coming from multiple directions, to be the center of something that other people had decided to stand around. The potion version of him, the suppressed and grateful version, would have found this overwhelming and would have spent considerable energy trying to diminish it, to say it wasn't necessary, to make himself smaller than the situation. He didn't do that. Thank them, he said. And tell them if they hear anything from the older students, anything about how the inquest is landing, what the narrative is, what Dumbledore's people are saying, I want to know. Ron nodded. And then he smiled, which was a good smile, wide and genuine and slightly crooked, and said, you know, when I heard Harry Potter was coming to Hogwarts, I thought, he stopped. I didn't think it was going to be anything like this. Neither did I, Harry said. And then something in him recognized the absurdity of it. 11 years old, 7 days into school, 3 letters to ministry departments and an inquest pending and a magic recalibrating at 60% and the fire crackling in the grate, and he laughed. It came out sudden and genuine and slightly startled, as though he hadn't been sure he was capable of it today. Ron grinned. There it is, he said. What? Someone said you hadn't laughed all week. I was starting to worry. Who said that? Neville. He's been tracking it. Ron said this entirely seriously. He has a list. Harry stared at him. Neville has a list of things I haven't done. He's concerned. He expresses concern through observation. Ron's grin widened. Don't tell him I told you. Harry shook his head, and the laugh came back, quieter this time, and the fire crackled, and the common room was warm. Dumbledore's second move came at midnight. Harry was asleep when the portraits in the Gryffindor Tower began murmuring, and he woke up because the portrait of Sir Cadogan at the end of the corridor had apparently been assigned a message, and Sir Cadogan, who had no volume setting between loud and extremely loud, delivered it by shouting through the dormitory door. Harry came downstairs to find the message wasn't for him. It was for McGonagall, delivered via portrait chain from Dumbledore's office, an announcement to the castle's portraits, which functioned as its internal communication system, that Albus Dumbledore was formally requesting a full staff meeting first thing in the morning, and that he wished the heads of house to know that he had received word from the ministry suggesting a possible compromise framework regarding the inquest that he wished to present. Harry stood at the bottom of the dormitory stairs in his pajamas and listened to Sir Cadogan's increasingly theatrical retelling of the message and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who recognizes a pivot. Compromise. The word had come from nowhere in the last 24 hours and had the specific smell of something that was not compromise at all. He went back to bed. Lay awake for 40 minutes thinking through what compromise meant and what it might be designed to do, and when he'd worked through it sufficiently he slept, clean and deep and without hesitation, the way he'd been sleeping all week, the way of someone who knows what they think and has made their decision. In the morning Hermione was already at breakfast when he came down. She'd read the prophet again. She had 3 pages of notes. She looked up when he sat down and said, before he could speak, he's going to propose a private settlement. Some form of recognition of harm with a confidentiality agreement. Probably financial compensation and some form of public apology that acknowledges regrettable decisions without admitting criminal liability. She looked at him steadily. He floated it through a ministry contact last night. It's not in the paper but there's a reference between the lines of Elphias Doge's opinion column. She turned the paper so he could see. Look at the 3rd paragraph. He uses the phrase restorative framework. That's not Doge's vocabulary. Harry read it. Dumbledore fed him that phrase. Yes. He's testing the concept publicly, with deniability, before making the formal offer. She looked at him. Harry. The settlement offer is going to be presented as generous. It's going to include things that are genuinely valuable. It will be framed as the Kinder path, for you, specifically. Less traumatic than a full public inquest. Private resolution. Move forward. Move forward and put him in charge of the narrative, Harry said. Yes. I won't take it, Harry said. She looked at him. Not because I don't want things to be easier, he said carefully. Not because I enjoy this. I won't take it because a private settlement means the record stays private. And if the record stays private, he stopped. Looked at the table. There are other children. There have been other children. I'm not the only person Dumbledore has made decisions for. The Wisengamot record of this inquest is public. It becomes precedent. It becomes something that can be pointed to, that can't be erased. He looked at Hermione. A settlement protects him. The inquest protects everyone who comes after. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, I know. She said it with the quiet solidity of someone who already agreed and just needed to hear him say it. He's going to make the offer personally, Harry said. He's going to ask to see me again and he's going to make it personal and kind and full of genuine care, and I need to be ready for that. He paused. Because it'll work, a little. It'll work on the part of me that remembers the potions even though the potions are gone. The shape of responding to him is worn into me and I need to be aware of that. I can come this time, Hermione said. He considered it. Then, no. Same reason as before. I need him to see me decide on my own. He looked at her. But I want you to know beforehand, I've decided. I'm not taking anything that closes the record. She looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded once, and that was that. The offer came at 3 in the afternoon, in McGonagall's office, with McGonagall present because this time Dumbledore had asked her to be, which Harry recognized as another layer of the approach, using McGonagall's presence to soften the setting, to make it feel institutional and safe rather than confrontational. It was everything Hermione had predicted and in some ways more sophisticated than predicted. Dumbledore presented it with the patient sorrow of a man who has examined himself and found fault, who is offering what he can because he genuinely wishes he could offer more. He spoke about Harry's well-being. About the toll of a public inquest on an 11-year-old. About the wizarding world's need for stability in the wake of Voldemort's legacy. About the good that could be done with the settlement resources. He was extraordinary. Harry sat in the chair across the desk, McGonagall's desk, a different geometry from Dumbledore's office, which made it fractionally easier, and listened to all of it without interrupting, because he'd decided on the train to Hogwarts, no, before that, somewhere in the hospital wing at 2 in the morning when the emotional suppression draft broke down, he'd decided that when people spoke to him, he would actually listen. Not wait to respond. Listen. He listened. And when Dumbledore finished, Harry said, "No." Dumbledore looked at him. Not the settlement, not the private resolution, not the confidentiality agreement. Harry's voice was completely even. "I understand why you're offering it and I understand that some of your reasons for offering it are genuine. You do want this to be less difficult for me. I believe that." He paused. "But the record needs to be public. There are other people it protects. That's not negotiable." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harry. You are 11 years old. The weight of a public inquest, the scrutiny, the political battle, the way it will follow you, will follow me regardless," Harry said. "Being Harry Potter follows me regardless. The question is whether the record is true or managed." He looked at Dumbledore directly. "You built me to accept things. To trust that the people making decisions for me knew best. To be grateful and small and not reach for more." He kept his voice level. "I'm not doing that anymore. Not with you, not with anyone." A long pause. McGonagall, who had been standing to the side with her hands clasped in her face, the careful neutrality of a woman holding herself very precisely still, made a sound that she converted into a small cough. "The inquest will be difficult for you," Harry said to Dumbledore. "I know that. I'm not here to destroy you, I told you that last time and I meant it. But you're going to stand in the Wizengamot and the record is going to be read and the world is going to know what was in that diagnostic basin." He paused. "That's what's going to happen. You can prepare for it or not. That's your choice, and for once, I'll let someone else make their own choice." He stood. Dumbledore looked at him, the old man, the most powerful wizard alive, the architect of 60 years of wizarding history, and in his expression, finally, something that was not warmth and was not calculation. Something older and quieter and without any performance in it at all. "You are," Dumbledore said, very quietly, "remarkable." "I know," Harry said. And walked out. McGonagall caught up with him in the corridor. She walked beside him without speaking for a moment, and then said, "Flitwick's emancipation petition was granted an hour ago. Griselda Marchbanks countersigned it this morning." Harry stopped walking. "You are," she said, "as of this afternoon, a legally emancipated minor under wizarding law. Full independent status. No guardian." He stood in the corridor and looked at the stone wall opposite and felt the thing land, quietly, without fanfare, the way the most significant things sometimes do. No guardian. Independent status. He was, under wizarding law, the first person with authority over his own life. He took a breath. "Thank you," he said. "Flitwick did the work," she said. "You pushed it through," he said. "I know you spoke to Marchbanks directly. Don't minimize it." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to hide. "No," she said quietly. "I won't." They walked back through the castle together, and the stones were old and the portraits watched them pass, and somewhere ahead the library was waiting with Hermione's organized notes and Neville's careful thinking and Ron's instinct and Percy's procedure and all the rest of it, all the people who had chosen to stand in this particular configuration around this particular situation. 2 days before the inquest. Harry Potter walked through his school and felt his magic moving through him at something approaching its full range for the first time in his life, warm and precise and vast and entirely his own, and he thought, I'm ready. Chapter 6, The Boy Who Chose the Wizengamot convened at 10 in the morning on the 17th of September, and the chamber was full before 9. Not full in the ordinary administrative sense, full in the way of a room that has understood its own historical significance and drawn people accordingly. The public gallery, which could seat 300 and was generally half occupied for even the most contentious proceedings, had a queue forming outside the ministry's phone box entrance from 6 in the morning. By 8:30 it was standing room only, and ministry officials were turning people away at the door. Harry arrived at 9:05 with Amelia Bones on his left and Phileas Flitwick on his right, and Augusta Longbottom 2 steps behind with the bearing of a woman who had been navigating this building for 4 decades and intended to remind it of that fact. He wore his Hogwarts robes without the house colors, which Hermione had suggested on the grounds that walking into the Wizengamot as a student of any particular house introduced an unnecessary framing, and Harry had agreed because it was correct. He wore them simply, without embellishment, which was also a choice. Everything today was a choice, made carefully, with full awareness of what it communicated. He walked through the ministry atrium and the enchanted gold fountain and the lifts and the corridors without hurrying, and the people who saw him did what they'd been doing since Tuesday, they looked. He let them look. He had stopped managing other people's attention and started simply existing in it, which was, it turned out, considerably more powerful. Hermione, Neville, and Ron were in the public gallery, which Harry had arranged through Flitwick's visitor access provision. McGonagall was there too, in the official staff capacity she'd requested. The twins were there, having apparently convinced a 7th-year prefect to sign their visitor forms, and Percy was there in his own right as the son of a ministry employee. Draco Malfoy was also there. Harry had not expected that. He saw him from the chamber floor, a slight, blonde figure in the gallery's 3rd row, sitting with the performative composure that Harry had come to read as Draco's version of anxiety. He was alone. No Crabbe, no Goyle, no Lucius. Harry caught his eye briefly, and Draco gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, and Harry filed it and moved on. The chamber itself was circular and tiered, with the Wizengamot members in their purple robes arranged in a wide sweep above the central floor. The chief warlock's seat at the apex was occupied, for the duration of this proceeding, by Griselda Marchbanks, a small, ancient woman with the compressed authority of someone who had been making important decisions since before most of the room was born. Dumbledore's seat as chief warlock was empty. Dumbledore himself was seated at the respondents' table on the chamber floor, across from Harry's own position. He had a solicitor, a precise, capable-looking woman named Euphemia Smythe who had been the most prominent magical defense advocate in Britain for 15 years. He sat in his chair with the same presence he always carried, the silver beard and the half-moon glasses and the robes in deep purple that were, Harry noticed, the same color as the Wizengamot members' own robes, a choice that was either unconscious or very deliberate. Dumbledore looked at Harry when he came in. Harry looked back. Neither of them looked away first this time. Madame Marchbanks called the chamber to order with a single strike of her staff on the stone floor, and the sound of it rang through the room and the room went still. This formal inquest convenes under the authority of the Wizengamot of Great Britain, she said, in a voice that was thin and sharp and completely without effort, the voice of someone who hadn't needed volume since approximately 1940. The matter before this chamber is the formal complaint filed by Harry James Potter, emancipated minor, against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, regarding unauthorized magical administration, compulsion of award, blood curse implantation, and conspiracy to cause grievous magical harm. She looked at the chamber. The record will be full and public. These proceedings will be published in their entirety. A pause. The Wizengamot has heard the preliminary evidence. The forensic reports are in the record. We will hear testimony today and render a finding. She looked between Harry and Dumbledore. Are both parties prepared? Yes, said Euphemia Smythe. Yes, said Harry. Marchbanks nodded. Madame Bones. The Ministry's case. Amelia Bones stood. She was wearing her monocle and her DMLE robes, and she had a single piece of parchment in her hand, which she didn't look at once during the entire opening. She spoke for 6 minutes and 40 seconds and every word landed clean. She presented the diagnostic record. The basin signatures. The forensic analysis of the blood curse, which the Ministry's curse-breaking division had completed 2 days ago and which established, with magical certainty, that the curse was designed from inception as a sacrifice mechanism, not a protective measure, not a wartime improvisation, but a deliberate architectural choice. She presented the Gringotts account records, which showed 63 withdrawals under Dumbledore's guardian signature, including 14,000 galleons to a fund that, Gringotts' own audit had confirmed, did not exist as a registered institution. She presented the memory modification analysis, which Pomfrey's additional diagnostic work had established was not limited to suppression. Several of Harry's early memories showed signs of targeted alteration, specific moments edited or softened, the compound applied with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were removing. She presented all of this without drama, without embellishment, in the flat, precise language of formal evidence, and it was exactly right because it didn't need embellishment. The facts were the drama. When she sat down, the chamber was very quiet. Euphemia Smythe stood. She was good. Harry had expected her to be good, and she was better than expected. She addressed the prophecy first, which was the right move, establishing context before the defense became defensive. She spoke of the war with genuine weight, invoking names that made people in the gallery press together slightly: Voldemort's attacks, the families lost, the world that had hung in the balance. She spoke of the impossible decisions made under impossible circumstances. She spoke of the genuine love that had informed every choice. She spoke of regret, which was real, and necessity, which was arguable, and she made the argument for both with the skill of a woman who had spent her career defending people who had done complicated things for complicated reasons. The prophecy mitigation, she argued, constituted a legitimate framework for extraordinary measures. What Dumbledore had done was not criminal intent. It was wartime governance, applied imperfectly to a situation with no good options. She was, Harry thought, excellent. He let it land completely. Sat through it without expression, without reacting to the parts designed to provoke reaction, without doing anything except listening and making notes. He wrote 3 things on his parchment, crossed 1 out, and underlined 2. When Smythe sat down, Marchbanks looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter. You have requested the right to speak directly to this chamber." "Yes," Harry said. "You may proceed." He stood. He had not prepared a speech in the way that speeches are usually prepared, drafted and redrafted and rehearsed in front of mirrors. He'd written notes. He'd thought it through, carefully and completely, over the last 10 days. But he'd deliberately not over-prepared it, because over-prepared speeches sound like over-prepared speeches, and the Wisingamot had already heard Euphemia Smythe's version of polish. He looked at the chamber. At the tiered rows of purple-robed members, at the public gallery above them, at the room in its entirety. He looked at it the way you look at something when you've decided to speak to it honestly. "I'm 11, he said. "I want to acknowledge that first, because I know it matters to some of you in this room, and not in the way I'd prefer. Some of you are looking at me and thinking that my age is a reason to discount what I say. Some of you have been told, perhaps by the prophet, perhaps by people you respect, that what I've done this week is the action of a traumatized child who doesn't fully understand the situation." He paused. "I want to address that directly before anything else, because if you've decided I'm too young to understand what was done to me, we can't have the rest of this conversation properly." The chamber was very still. "I understand what was done to me," Harry said. "I understand it in technical detail, because I read the primary sources. I understand it in personal terms, because I lived it for 11 years. And I understand it in legal terms, because I've spent 10 days with Wisingamot statutes and very good people who know them." He looked at the members. "I'm asking you to take that seriously. Not because I'm exceptional, though I'm aware that argument will be made, but because the age of the victim does not determine the validity of the complaint. He let that sit for a moment. Madam Smythe gave you the defense, Harry continued. The war. The prophecy. The impossible circumstances. The genuine love. I want to be very clear about something, I don't dispute most of it. He paused, and the pause brought attention forward the way silence always does. The war was real. What Voldemort did was real. The prophecy exists, I've seen it, I've heard it, I understand what it says. And Albus Dumbledore's love for the wizarding world is real. I believe that entirely. He looked at Dumbledore across the chamber floor. The problem, Harry said, is that genuine love for a cause, and genuine belief in the necessity of a method, and genuine intelligence applied to a decision, none of those things make the decision right. They make it understandable. They make it explicable. They do not make it right. He returned his gaze to the chamber. 52 compounds in an infant. Memory alteration in a 5-year-old. A blood curse installed in the magical core of a 7-year-old that was designed, not accidentally, not incidentally, but deliberately and specifically, to maximize his power output at the moment of his death. He paused. That is not wartime governance. That is not a regrettable necessity. That is the construction of a child for a purpose, without his consent, without the consent of any living person who had his interests at heart, carried out over a decade with the precision of someone who had decided that the plan was more important than the person. He was not raising his voice. He didn't need to. The chamber's acoustics were perfect and his voice was steady and clear and it carried the specific weight of someone who has fully inhabited what they're saying. Madam Smythe asked you to consider the alternative, Harry said. She implied there wasn't one. I want to suggest that there was. He looked at the chamber members. I was told I could not be informed of the prophecy, because knowledge of it would break me. I was told I could not have my full magical capability, because I might use it recklessly. I was told I could not be trusted to face what was coming with full knowledge and full power and full autonomy, because I might make the wrong choice. He looked directly at Dumbledore again. And I want to ask, compared to what? A small sound moved through the chamber. Compared to being built into a weapon. Compared to being engineered to die willingly. Compared to spending 11 years not fully existing because someone decided I was better off as a function than as a person. He held the silence for a moment. I was told I couldn't be trusted to make my own choices. And the alternative to trusting me was to remove my ability to choose at all. He paused. I do not call that love. I understand how a person can believe it is. I cannot call it that. He took a breath. The war was won, he said, and his voice shifted, not softer, exactly, but different in register, addressing something larger. Voldemort is defeated, at least for now. The wizarding world survived. I understand that those facts are real and important and I do not minimize them. But the method matters. Not just for me, for what we decide, in this room today, about what is acceptable. He looked at the Wizengamot members. If we decide that the end justified these means, we decide something about ourselves. We decide that an extraordinary person with extraordinary conviction can make extraordinary decisions about the people in their care without accountability, and that the results are the only measure of whether that was acceptable. He paused. I think most of you know what happens when we accept that framework. You lived through a war started by someone who believed exactly that. The silence that followed was absolute. He'd not planned that last comparison. It had come naturally, the way the right thing sometimes does when you've been honest about what you're actually arguing. He watched it land, the slight physical shift that moved through the chamber, the thing that happened in people's faces. Dumbledore was very still. I'm not comparing Albus Dumbledore to Voldemort, Harry said clearly, before anyone could frame it that way. I'm saying that good intentions are not sufficient insulation against accountability. That is the only point. The greatest wizard of the age is not above the law that protects children. Not because I want to punish him, I don't. But because if he's above it, then everyone with sufficient conviction and sufficient power is above it, and that is a world none of us want to live in. He looked at the chamber one more time, at the whole sweep of it, the purple robes and the high stone walls and the gallery above full of people who had come from across Britain because this moment mattered. "I've been asked what I want," he said. "By people in this building, by journalists, by people who seem to think that what I want is destruction or revenge or some form of victory. I want the record to be true and public, so that it cannot be buried. I want my godfather freed from a prison he was put in without a trial, which is something this body has the power to address today. I want my accounts restored and my guardianship clear." He paused. "And I want it to be established, formally and permanently, that what was done to me was wrong. Not complicated. Not regrettable. Not necessary. Wrong." He looked at the chamber. "So that the next child that someone decides to build for a purpose has somewhere to point." He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Marchbanks struck her staff on the stone floor. "We will hear from the respondent." Dumbledore stood. And Harry watched him stand, the old man rising from his chair with the unhurried dignity of someone who has stood in front of many rooms and known how to fill them, and saw something that he had not expected to see. Dumbledore had tears in his eyes. Not performed tears. Not the calculated vulnerability of a practiced orator. Something real, coming up through all that extraordinary composure, breaking the surface whether he wanted it to or not. He stood in front of the Wisingamot and looked at Harry across the chamber floor, and the tears were simply there, visible, and he made no move to conceal them. "Everything Mr. Potter has said," Dumbledore said, "is true." Euphemia Smythe's head turned sharply toward him. He did not look at her. Every compound. Every intention. Every calculation. His voice was steady but had something in it that had not been there in his office, in any of their private conversations. Something stripped. I genuinely believed, that I was protecting him. Protecting all of you. I believed that the prophecy was a fixed point and that my role was to manage it as safely as possible. He paused. I have spent 60 years believing that my understanding of what is necessary and what is good is sufficient grounds for action. I have been wrong about that. I am wrong about that. He looked at the chamber, at the members, at the gallery. Not wrong about the war. Not wrong about Voldemort. Wrong about the method. Wrong about my right to make these decisions. He looked at Harry one more time. Wrong about the boy. The chamber was completely still. I will not contest the finding, Dumbledore said. I will not contest the emancipation. I will not contest the account restitution. He paused. And I will support, formally and on the record, the immediate review of Sirius Black's case. He looked at Marchbanks. Whatever this body determines to be appropriate, I will not stand against it. He sat down. Euphemia Smythe closed her notes with the specific quality of a professional acknowledging that her client has just changed the entire nature of the proceedings, and she sat back in her chair with her hands folded and a carefully neutral expression. The chamber deliberated for 2 hours. Harry sat at the respondents' table and waited with the stillness that had become, over 10 days, his natural register. Flitwick was beside him. Bones was nearby. Augusta Longbottom was in the gallery sitting very upright with her hands on her cane, and Harry could feel her attention from across the room the way you feel weather. He thought about Sirius Black. He'd been thinking about him a great deal over the last 10 days, about a man in a cell in the North Sea, 11 years gone, who had been put there without anyone asking whether he deserved to be. He thought about the letter he'd sent, and whether it had gotten through, and whether Sirius knew anything of what was happening or whether he was sitting in his cell in the particular darkness of Azkaban and had no idea that an 11-year-old was in the Wisingamot on his behalf. He thought about what it would mean to walk out of this chamber today. At 2:30, Marchbanks returned to the chamber. She struck her staff. The Wisingamot finds, by a vote of 31 to 8, that the actions of Albus Dumbledore against Harry James Potter constitute unauthorized magical administration to a minor, compulsion of a ward, and deliberate blood curse implantation with criminal intent. The forensic evidence of the blood curse's design establishes conspiracy to cause grievous magical harm. She looked at the chamber and then at Dumbledore. The Wisengamot further finds that the respondent's voluntary acknowledgement of these facts, and his stated intention not to contest the finding, constitutes a significant mitigating factor in the matter of sentencing. Harry kept his face still. Albus Dumbledore is hereby stripped of the title of Chief Warlock of the Wisengamot, effective immediately. He is removed from the position of Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, effective immediately. He is placed under a formal Wisengamot supervision order for a period of not less than 5 years, during which any significant action he takes in his capacity as headmaster of Hogwarts must be reviewed by a standing committee. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore directly. He retains his liberty and his position at Hogwarts at this time, subject to the supervision order and the ongoing monitoring of said committee. The gallery made a sound. Not a single sound, the layered, complex sound of a large group of people receiving a decision they had various feelings about simultaneously. Some of it was relief. Some was dissatisfaction. He heard, from somewhere in the upper gallery, a voice that said "That's all?" with genuine outrage. Some of it was something more complicated than either. Harry looked at the finding. He had expected the liberty provision. He had thought, carefully, about whether that was the right outcome, and he'd arrived somewhere that was not comfortable but was honest. Azkaban would be wrong. Not because what Dumbledore had done was small, it wasn't small, but because Azkaban destroyed people, and the destruction of Albus Dumbledore would not protect a single child from the next person who believed their conviction was sufficient grounds for action. The supervision order, the public record, the stripping of his institutional power, those things did something. They changed the structure. They made it harder for the next person. That was what mattered. He let the not comfortable feeling sit without trying to resolve it. Marchbanks struck her staff again. In the separate matter of Sirius Black's commitment to Azkaban, the Wisengamot finds that said commitment occurred without trial proceedings and without formal conviction, in violation of Section 12 of the Wisengamot Protections Act. The commitment is hereby declared void. She paused. Sirius Orion Black will be released from Azkaban with immediate effect. A formal hearing to determine the full circumstances of his case will be scheduled within 30 days. She looked at Harry. Given the evidence regarding his wrongful commitment, the ministry will bear the cost of his immediate restorative healing care. He is cleared of all charges pending the formal hearing. Something went through Harry that was not the cold clarity of the last 10 days. It was warm. It hit him somewhere under the ribs and stayed there, warm and real and without the pharmaceutical softness of manufactured gratitude, just the genuine, uncut feeling of something right happening, of a wrong being undone, however partially, however late. He breathed through it. Flitwick's hand appeared briefly on his arm and then withdrew, which was enough. The account restitution order came next, the 63 unauthorized withdrawals to be repaid in full from Dumbledore's personal accounts, with a formal audit of the Hogwarts Discretionary Fund, which had been confirmed by Gringotts to not exist as a registered institution, meaning the 14,000 galleons had gone somewhere that was now subject to formal investigation. The emancipation, already granted, was formally entered into the Wisengamot record with full legal weight. When Marchbanks concluded the finding, struck her staff for the last time, and the chamber began to stir and rise and turn toward each other with all the noise that follows a long silence, Harry sat for a moment. He sat and looked at the chamber, at the tiered rows, at the public gallery where Hermione was holding her copy of the statute book against her chest like it had won something, where Ron was sitting with his face doing that wide and censored thing it did when something happened that was larger than his usual frame, where Neville was very still and very straight in a way that was new for him, the way of someone who has recently remembered that they have a spine. He looked at the twins, who were absolutely not crying and would deny any suggestion to the contrary. He looked at McGonagall, who was sitting in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and the expression of a woman who has done what she could and found it to have been, in the end, enough. He looked at Dumbledore. The old man was sitting at the respondent's table, and his solicitor was speaking to him in a low voice, and he was listening, but his eyes were not on Euphemia Smythe. His eyes were on Harry, and in them was an expression that was not the warm, grandfatherly light of the headmaster of Hogwarts and was not the calculating intelligence of the political operator. It was older than either of those. It was the expression of a man at the end of a very long road looking back at what he'd carried and understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of it. Harry held his gaze. Then he stood, and turned, and walked out. The corridor outside the chamber was stone and echoing and abruptly quiet after the room's noise. Flitwick walked beside him and then peeled off to speak with Marchbanks. Bones was 2 steps behind. Augusta Longbottom appeared from the gallery staircase at the corridor's end, walking with the precise deliberateness of someone covering ground efficiently. And then the lift opened and Hermione came out of it at speed, followed closely by Neville and then Ron, and she was not running exactly but she was moving very fast and her hair was even more disorganized than usual, which was its own indicator of emotional state, and she stopped in front of Harry and looked at him with an expression that was all the things she hadn't said during 2 weeks of legal preparation and library work and very precise, practical help. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You were extraordinary." He looked at her. He thought about deflecting it, the old reflex was still there, the shape of it worn into him even without the potions, and he recognized it and let it pass. "Thank you," he said. "So were you." She made a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances and then she did something that surprised both of them, she hugged him. It was brief and slightly awkward because she was not naturally a hugger and he was not naturally a person who had been hugged, but it was real, and he felt it, and when she stepped back they were both slightly different for it. Ron punched his shoulder lightly, which for Ron was the equivalent of a speech. Neville stood beside him and said nothing, and that was also enough. They walked back through the ministry together, through the corridors and the lifts and the atrium with its golden fountain, which Harry looked at as he passed and thought about what it represented, the hierarchy of magical beings cast in gold, which was something he was going to have thoughts about another day when today was finished. Through the phone box entrance and up into the London street, grey September afternoon, ordinary traffic and ordinary noise and the world going about its business without knowing what had just happened in the room below. Harry stood on the pavement and breathed the outside air. Neville appeared at his shoulder. "What happens now?" Not anxious, genuinely curious. The question of someone who has stopped expecting bad answers. "Now," Harry said, and thought about it properly. "Sirius gets out. That'll take a day, maybe 2, the release process and getting him to a healer." He paused. "The inquest record goes public tomorrow. The Prophet will run it. Other papers will run it. There will be," he searched for the word, "noise." "A lot of noise," Hermione confirmed. "Yes. And then term continues and there's a lot of school that needs happening." He looked at them. "And there's still Voldemort. He hasn't gone, the prophecy is still real. The situation hasn't resolved. We've just changed the terms of it." "How?" Ron said. Harry thought about this. About the blood curse dissolving from his magical core over the last 10 days, about the full range of his magic moving through him cleanly now, unimpeded. About the difference between a weapon that doesn't know what it is and a person who has chosen to stand somewhere. "The difference between what was planned and what's going to happen," he said, "is that now I choose." He looked at them. "No one's engineering the ending anymore. Whatever comes with Voldemort, whenever, however, I'll face it knowing what it is. With full capability. And the people I want standing with me." He paused. "That's not the same situation it was 2 weeks ago." "No," Neville said quietly. "It's really not." They stood on the London pavement for a moment, the 4 of them, in the grey September afternoon, and the city moved around them, indifferent and enormous and full of its own ordinary concerns, and Harry felt the particular sensation of standing at the start of something. Not the start of Hogwarts, that start had been someone else's beginning, scripted and managed and pharmaceutical. This was a different start. His own. He thought about a letter he'd sent to a man in a cell in the North Sea, 10 days ago, that said hold on. He thought, he doesn't have to hold on anymore. That thought was a warm one. He let it stay. The owl found him before they'd gone a block. It came from above, descending in a controlled banking curve that spoke to a bird that had been following them from the ministry, waiting for the right moment. It landed on Harry's shoulder with the grip of a large bird that knew exactly what it was doing, a powerful tawny, wingspan remarkable, with a letter tied to its leg in string that had been knotted with one hand by someone whose other hand was, perhaps, not functioning at full capacity. Harry untied it. The handwriting was shaky. Not the shake of old age, the shake of someone who had been somewhere that takes things from you, that dismantles you in specific ways, and who was writing this in the first hour of not being there anymore. The letters were large and uneven and clearly took considerable effort to form, but the effort had been made, and what had been written was very short. I got your letter. Both of them, somehow. The first one 3 days ago, I don't know how it got through, and the second one this morning about the inquest. I have been in that place for 11 years and I did not know anyone was coming. Hold on, you said. I held on. Thank you. Serious P.S. I hear you're in Gryffindor. Your father would have been insufferably pleased. I am also insufferably pleased. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his chest pocket, against his ribs, where it sat with the warmth of something specific and real and entirely his own. Hermione was watching him. She had read it over his shoulder. She always read things over his shoulder, which he had already decided he didn't mind. Her expression was doing what it did when something landed, when it passed from the analytical register into the other one, the one where she was simply Hermione Granger who was 11 years old and had decided to stand with this particular person and meant it. Good, she said quietly. Yeah, Harry said. They walked back toward the ministry entrance because they needed to fly back to Hogwarts, and as they walked Harry thought about the school waiting for him, the corridors and the portraits and the library and the Gryffindor common room with its fire, and the year ahead, which was going to be complicated and full of things he couldn't predict yet and which he was going to face as himself, fully, without pharmaceutical softening or engineered deference or anyone's careful management of who he was allowed to be. He thought about Voldemort, somewhere out in the world in whatever diminished and gathering form he currently occupied, working toward return. He thought about the prophecy, not with dread, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who has looked at a difficult problem and started thinking about how to solve it on their own terms. Neither can live while the other survives. But there was a version of that resolution that wasn't a manufactured sacrifice and wasn't an engineered death and wasn't the terminal release of a blood curse designed in someone else's office. There was a version where Harry Potter stood in front of that problem as himself and made a choice. He didn't know yet what that looked like. He had time to find out. He crossed back into the ministry atrium, and the golden fountain reflected its hierarchy in the still water of its pool, and he walked past it without breaking stride, and he thought, one thing at a time. Hogwarts first. Sirius next, when he was strong enough for visitors. Then whatever came after. He stepped into the flue with Hermione at his shoulder and Ron at his back and Neville steady at his side, and the green fire took him, and the ministry vanished, and the castle came rushing up around him, cold stone and moving portraits and the smell of parchment and old magic and the particular quality of a very large building that had been holding students for 1,000 years and would hold them for 1,000 more, and he stepped out of the fireplace in McGonagall's office and stood up. Straight. He was back. He was, for the first time, entirely and completely and irreversibly himself. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Outside, the September afternoon was turning toward evening, and the lake was catching what was left of the light, and the Hogwarts grounds were exactly as they had been for 1,000 years, the beech trees at the water's edge, the Quidditch pitch empty and waiting, the greenhouses glinting, the forbidden forest dark at the edge of things. Harry looked at all of it through McGonagall's window. He thought, mine. Not in the proprietary sense. In the other sense, the sense of belonging, of having arrived somewhere that he had chosen, that had not been chosen for him. The sense of standing in a life that was actually his. He turned from the window. "Right," he said to the room, to Hermione and Ron and Neville who had come through behind him and were arranging themselves in McGonagall's office with the comfortable ease of people who have been through something together and come out the other side. "I think we need dinner." Ron's expression achieved something that was possibly the most wholehearted agreement Harry had ever seen a face express. "Absolutely," Hermione said, already moving toward the door. Neville was already in the corridor. Harry followed, and the door closed behind him, and the castle received them, all four of them, ordinary and extraordinary and entirely themselves, and the evening came on, and somewhere over the North Sea a man who had held on for 11 years was breathing fresh air for the first time, and somewhere in a deep part of the world a diminished dark thing was gathering itself and waiting, and none of that was resolved, and all of it was coming, and Harry Potter walked down the corridor toward the great hall with his friends and his hunger and his whole entire actual self, and he was not afraid of any of it. Not even a little.